Thank you for joining in today's Cryptid Horror Stories. The first story today is called The White Tide of Margate, and this is a horror story about the Trunko. And in this story, the discovery of a hidden diary from a 1924 Margate Coast Guard. The journal reveals that the carcass that washed ashore in 1924 didn't disappear. It was reclaimed. The journal describes how the creature's dead body continued to twitch for 10 days, absorbing the saltwater and the curiosity of the locals, before sliding back into the ocean with a coordinated, intentional movement. It wasn't a carcass, it was a dormant state. The second story today is called The Bending Pines, and this is a horror story about the Chickcharney. And in this story, a group of 5 arrogant urban explorers and cryptid hunters travel to the interior of Andros Island. Their goal isn't respect or study. They are filming a high-production series aimed at debunking local myths for views. They bring drones, loud equipment, and a general disdain for the superstitions of the locals who warned them about the pine forests. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped. Also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The White Tide of Margate. The fiber was not hair. This was the first thing the laboratory technician noted in her report, typed in the flat, affectless prose of a person who had been trained to describe what she saw without interpreting it, to record without concluding, to present the data, and let the data speak for itself, even when the data was saying something that no language she had been taught could adequately contain. Specimen retrieved from tracheal lining of deceased male, approximately 45 years of age, cause of death asphyxiation by drowning. Foreign body found embedded in the mucosal tissue of the posterior tracheal wall. Initial visual assessment: white fiber, approximately 4.2 centimeters in length, 0.3 millimeters in diameter, resembling mammalian fur or hair. Microscopic analysis reveals the fiber is not composed of keratin. The fiber appears to be a translucent, tubular structure with a central lumen containing what appears to be neural tissue. Nerve fibers are visible within the structure and exhibit spontaneous electrical activity at a frequency of 0.7 Hz. The fiber is, as of the time of this report, still pulsing. The technician's name was Callie van der Merwe. She was 26 years old, a junior forensic biologist at the Oceanographic Research Institute of South Africa, and she had been assigned to the case because the drowned man had been found in the waters off Margate, on the KwaZulu-Natal coast, and the institute had a standing agreement with the local authorities to analyze any marine-related deaths that fell outside the normal parameters of coastal drownings. A man who drowns is not in the normal course of things, found with foreign fibers embedded in his trachea. Drowning is a mechanical process. Water enters the airway, displaces the air, the body suffocates. The trachea fills with seawater, foam, and occasionally sand or debris if the drowning occurred in shallow, turbulent water. It does not fill with white, nerve-rich fibers that pulse. Callie had placed the fiber in a petri dish under the microscope. She had adjusted the magnification. She had looked through the eyepiece, and she had seen, in the clinical, well-lit, perfectly rational environment of a laboratory in Cape Town, something that did not belong in the clinical, well-lit, perfectly rational world. The fiber was alive. Not alive in the way a strand of hair is alive at the follicle, with the cellular activity of the root still producing keratin. Alive in the way a nerve is alive, conducting, signaling, communicating. The fiber's central lumen was filled with neural tissue, not ganglion, not axon, but something that was structurally closer to a nerve than to anything else in the biological lexicon, but that did not match any known neural architecture. The electrical activity was rhythmic, regular, intentional. It pulsed at 0.7 Hz once every 1.43 seconds, and the pulse was not the random, arrhythmic discharge of dying tissue. It was organized, synchronized, the pulse of a thing that was not dying but dormant. A thing that was waiting. Callie had written her report. She had submitted it to her supervisor, Dr. Pieter Coetzee, a marine biologist with 25 years of experience and a reputation for meticulous, humorless, fundamentally incurious science. Dr. Coetzee had read the report. He had looked at the fiber under the microscope. He had looked at Callie. "This is contamination," he said. "It's embedded in the tracheal mucosa, Dr. Coetzee. It's not a contaminant. It was in the body when the body was in the water. Then it's a parasite, some kind of marine organism that colonized the airway post-mortem. The neural tissue is integrated with the mucosal tissue, Dr. Coetzee. The fiber has grown into the tracheal wall. It was not deposited there. It colonized there, and it's still alive." Dr. Coetzee had looked at the fiber again. He had looked at it for a long time. Then he had closed the microscope, taken off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said the thing that rational men say when the rational world has failed them. "Run the DNA analysis." Callie ran the DNA analysis. The results came back in 3 days. The fiber was not human. It was not mammalian. It was not fish. It was not crustacean. It was not any organism in the database. It was not in the database because it had never been sequenced. It had never been sequenced because no one had ever found one alive. The only record of anything resembling this fiber, white, fur-like, nerve-rich, attached to a massive marine creature, was in a diary that was sitting at that moment in the archives of the Margate Museum, in a box labeled 1924, Unsorted Donations, in a handwriting that had not been read in 99 years. The diary belonged to a man named Alastair Huguenot. Huguenot had been a Coast Guard officer stationed at Margate in 1924. He was 31 years old. He was British-born, South African-raised, a man of the sea in the way that men of the sea are not a sailor but a guardian, a person who stood at the edge of the land and watched the water and kept the records of what the water brought in and what the land sent out. His diary was not a personal journal. It was a duty log, a formal daily record of weather conditions, tidal patterns, shipping movements, and items of note observed along the coast. It was written in a cramped, meticulous hand, in ink that had faded from black to brown, on paper that was brittle and foxed and that smelled, when Callie opened it in the museum's archive room, of salt and dust and the particular, indefinable scent of old paper that has been waiting a long time to be read. Callie had found the diary through Sasha. Sasha Cunning was an archivist at the Margate Museum. She was 23, fresh out of the University of KwaZulu-Natal with a degree in historical preservation and a passion for what she called the unsorted. She was the person who had inherited the museum's backlog of uncatalogued donations, boxes of photographs, letters, newspapers, and miscellaneous documents that had been accumulating in the museum's storage room since the 1970s, and that no one had had the time or the funding to sort through. Sasha had found the diary in a box labeled 1924, Unsorted Donations, while looking for material related to the Margate sea monster, the creature that had washed ashore in October 1924, and that had, for 10 days, lain on the beach while the town stared at it and the newspapers photographed it, and the scientists argued about what it was. The story of the Margate sea monster, later nicknamed Trunko, was well known in cryptozoological circles. On October 25, 1924, witnesses on Margate Beach reported seeing a massive white creature battling 2 killer whales offshore. The battle lasted 3 hours. The creature, estimated at 40 to 50 feet in length, was covered in white fur and possessed a trunk-like appendage and a lobster-like tail. It used the tail to slap the water and at one point lifted itself an estimated 20 feet into the air. The creature eventually washed ashore. It lay on the beach for 10 days. No scientist examined it. No samples were taken. By the time anyone with credentials arrived, the carcass had been washed back out to sea by a high tide and it was gone. The official explanation decades later was that the creature had been a decomposed whale, specifically a globster, a mass of blubber and connective tissue that had been so decomposed that its original form was unrecognizable. The white fur was interpreted as connective tissue fibers exposed by decomposition. The trunk was a misidentified jaw or rostrum. The lobster tail was a fluke. Sasha had heard the story. Everyone in Margate had heard the story. It was part of the town's identity, a roadside attraction, a trivia question, a ghost story for tourists. But Sasha had found the diary, and the diary told a different story. The diary's entries for October 1924 were written in Huguenot's usual cramped, formal hand, but as the days progressed, the handwriting deteriorated. The letters grew larger. The lines slanted. The ink was pressed harder into the paper, as though the pen were being gripped by a hand that was tightening. October 25, 1924. Weather overcast, wind SW 15 knots, tide high at 14:30. Visibility poor, see State 4. At approximately 09:00, observed disturbance offshore bearing ENE distance est, 500 yards. 2 whale species, orca engaged with third object. Third object large, white, visible at surface. Initially assumed to be whale or large fish. Upon observation through telescope, object appears to be covered in white fur or hair. Object possesses appendage extending from anterior region, resembling trunk of elephant. Object is fighting whales. Object using posterior appendage, resembling tail of lobster to strike water. Object raised itself from water to height of approx. 20 feet. Object fell back to water. Fighting continued for 3 hours. At approx. 12:00, object ceased movement, assumed dead. Tide carried object shoreward. Object beached at approx. 13:00, 200 yards south of lighthouse. Object is approx. 47 feet in length. Body is covered in white fur 40+ cm in length. Fur is dense, matted with seawater. Trunk appendage is 5 feet in length, 2 feet in diameter at base, tapered. Trunk appears to be muscular and flexible. Tail is 10 feet in length, flattened, resembling tail of crustacean. No visible eyes, no visible mouth, no visible gills or blowhole. Object appears to be dead, but fur is moving, not wind, not water. Fur is moving on its own. Each individual fiber appears to be illegible. Will observe. October 26. Object still on beach. No decomposition, no smell of decay. Fur still moving, more pronounced today. Fibers appear to be extending, reaching outward from body, then retracting. Like tentacles, like fingers, have touched nothing. Do not intend to touch. Tide did not reach object. High tide at 14:45. Water line stopped 3 yards short of object. Object appears to be positioned above high water mark. Do not understand how this is possible, as object was floating when it beached. It should be below high water mark. It is not. October 27. Third day, object unchanged. No decomposition. No scavengers. Gulls will not approach. Dogs will not approach. A farmer, Hugh Balance, visited beach, stated object resembled giant polar bear. Mr. Balance attempted to touch the fur. I warned him not to. He touched it. He said it was warm. He said it was not fur. He said it felt like nerves. He left quickly. Fur fibers now extending to length of 60+ cm. They reach toward the water at high tide but do not reach it. They reach toward Mr. Balance when he approaches but do not touch him. They are sensing. I am certain of this. They are sensing the environment. I have made a note to contact the museum in Durban. No response yet. October 28. Fifth day, object appears to have grown. Length now est, 50 feet. Girth increased. Trunk appendage now est, 6 feet. Fur fibers now 70+ cm. Body is absorbing something, not water. I have observed the sand around the object. It is dry. The object is not absorbing water. It is absorbing something else. Salt, air, light. I do not know, I do not understand, but the object is not dead. It was never dead. The battle with the whales was not a fight. It was I do not have the word. The whales were not attacking it. They were trying to move it, to push it toward shore, as if they knew it needed to be on land, as if they were helping it. October 29. The fur is not fur, I am certain of this now. The fur is a sensory organ. Each fiber is a nerve. Each fiber is connected to the body and to every other fiber. The body is not an animal. It is a system, a network. The white fibers are its eyes, its ears, its nose, its skin. The body is the core. The fibers are the periphery, and the periphery is expanding. Fibers now extending 100 plus cm from body. They have reached the high tide line. At high tide, the fibers touch the water. When they touch the water, the body spasms. A single, coordinated contraction, as if the water is activating it. As if the water is a key and the body is a lock and the fibers are the hand turning the key. October 30. 8th day, body has grown to 55 feet. Fibers extend 150 plus cm. They have reached the water table beneath the sand. I can see the sand sinking around the body as the fibers penetrate beneath the surface. The body is not growing by eating. It is growing by connecting, by extending its nervous system into the environment, into the sand, into the water, into the air. It is waking up. October 31. 10th day, I contacted the museum in Durban. They are sending a team. They will arrive tomorrow. I do not think they should arrive tomorrow. The body moved last night. Not a spasm, not a twitch. A movement, a coordinated, intentional full-body movement. The fibers contracted, the body arched, the trunk appendage flexed, and the body slid toward the water 3 feet in one movement. Silent. No sound of friction, no displacement of sand. It slid as if the sand were liquid, as if the body were swimming through the ground. It is not dead, it was never dead, it is dormant, and it is waking up. I have written to the museum to cancel the visit. My letter will not arrive in time. They will come. They will find nothing. By tomorrow, the body will be in the water, and the water will take it, and no one will believe me when I tell them what I saw. I am writing this because I need someone to believe me. I need someone to know that the thing on the beach was not a carcass. It was not a globster. It was not a decomposed whale. It was a living creature in a state of dormancy, and it used the 10 days on the beach to absorb the salt and the minerals and the warmth of the sun and the curiosity of the people who came to look at it. And now it is ready, and it is going back to the water, and it will be in the water, and the water is vast, and it will be there. And I do not think it is the only one. November 1. The body is gone, the sand where it lay is bare. There is no residue, no bones, no fur, no fibers, nothing. The tide last night was high, the highest of the month. The water reached the spot where the body lay, and the body went into the water, not washed out, not dragged. It went, on its own, with the same coordinated, silent, sliding movement I saw last night. It entered the water and it submerged and it was gone and the sea closed over it and the sea is the sea and the sea keeps its secrets. But I saw it, and I am writing it down, and I am putting this diary in a box and I am putting the box in a place where someone will find it, and I hope that when they find it they will read it, and I hope that when they read it they will believe it, because the thing that was on the beach is in the water now and the water is not safe, and it will come back. And when it comes back, it will not be dormant. It will be awake. Callie read the diary in the archive room of the Margate Museum. She read it twice. She read it a third time, slowly, making notes, cross-referencing Huguenot's observations with the data from her own analysis of the fiber. The archive room was small and windowless, lit by a single fluorescent tube that buzzed with the particular institutional frequency that is designed to prevent drowsiness, and that instead produces a low-grade, constant headache. The room smelled of paper and dust, and the faint, acrid tang of the preservation chemicals that Sasha used on the older documents. The shelves were metal, industrial, bolted to the walls, filled with boxes of varying age and decrepitude, each labeled in a different hand, each containing a different slice of Margate's history. Shipwreck records, lighthouse maintenance logs, weather observations dating back to 1893, and in the box labeled 1924, unsorted donations, the diary of Alastair Huguenot. Callie's notes were meticulous. She had a legal pad, the kind with the yellow paper and the blue lines and the red margin, and she was writing in the same clipped, technical, observation without interpretation style that she had used in her lab report. But the notes were not technical. They were observational, recorded facts, cross-referenced, compared, and the comparison was not reassuring. Huguenot described the fibers as alive. Callie had found them alive. Huguenot described them as extending, growing, reaching. Callie's fiber had been growing in the Petri dish, slowly, imperceptibly, but measurably. She had checked it that morning. It was 4.3 centimeters now. It had been 4.2 when she'd placed it in the dish. Huguenot described the body as absorbing something from the environment, not water, not food, but something invisible. Callie's DNA analysis had revealed an organism that did not match any known life form, an organism that existed outside the taxonomic framework of all terrestrial biology, an organism that was not animal and not plant and not fungus and not bacterium, but something else, something that had no category because no one had ever needed a category for it before. The fiber from the drowned man's trachea was the same fiber that Huguenot had described in 1924. White, not keratin, nerve-rich, pulsing, part of a sensory network, a living, growing, extending network that had been dormant on a beach in 1924 and that had, sometime in the 100 years since, woken up. She looked at Sasha. Sasha was sitting across the table, her laptop open, her face the particular pale, focused color of someone who has been reading something that they did not expect to believe and who has, against their own better judgment, begun to believe it. "The drowned man," Callie said, "the one whose body I analyzed, where was he found?" 2 miles off the Margate coast. A fishing boat pulled him out. He'd been in the water for approximately 6 hours. The Coast Guard said he'd fallen off a charter vessel. "Which charter vessel?" Sasha looked at her laptop. She scrolled through a document. "The Meridian Star, a deep-sea heritage cruise. It sailed 3 days ago. The same route, the exact coordinates, where the 1924 sighting occurred." Callie felt the room shift. Not physically, epistemically. The floor was the same. The walls were the same. The archive room with its metal shelves and its fluorescent lights and its boxes of unsorted history was the same. But the world that the room sat in had changed, because the world that the room sat in now contained a thing that Callie had not previously believed was in it. "The cruise," Callie said. "How many people are on it?" Sasha checked. 62 passengers, 18 crew, 80 people total. "Where is it now?" Sasha checked again. She looked up from the screen. Her face had gone from pale to white. "It's not answering," she said. "The Meridian Star is not answering its radio." The Meridian Star was not a research vessel. It was a floating luxury hotel. Built in 2019 at a shipyard in Helsinki, the Meridian Star was 280 feet long, 60 feet at the beam, and registered under the flag of the Marshall Islands. It had been commissioned by a private company called Deep Sea Heritage Expeditions, a niche cruise line that catered to the ultra-wealthy with an interest in maritime history and a willingness to spend $15,000 a night for the privilege of sleeping above the exact coordinates of historical naval engagements, shipwrecks, and sea monster sightings. The ship was opulent in the way that only things designed for people who have too much money can be opulent. Every surface was either polished teak, brushed stainless steel, or white leather. The dining room seated 80. The bar was stocked with single malts that cost more per bottle than the monthly salary of the ship's engineers. There was a spa. There was a library. There was a climate-controlled cigar lounge on the upper deck, where the air smelled of cedar and old money. There were 80 people on board, 62 passengers, wealthy, tanned, and dressed in the aggressively casual attire of people who wanted the world to know they were on vacation. 18 crew, officers, engineers, hospitality staff, and a small scientific team hired to give the cruise the thin veneer of academic legitimacy that the marketing department required. The cruise was marketed as the Ghost of Margate, a deep-sea heritage expedition. The brochure, which Callie would later find on the Deep Sea Heritage website, described the itinerary in the breathless, capitalized style of luxury travel marketing. Journey to the heart of one of the ocean's greatest mysteries. In October 1924, the residents of Margate, South Africa, witnessed a creature unlike anything recorded in human history. A 47-foot, white-furred marine anomaly that battled 2 killer whales for 3 hours before washing ashore. For 10 days, the creature lay on Margate Beach, defying explanation. Then it vanished. Join us as we sail to the exact coordinates of the 1924 sighting, where our onboard team of marine biologists will conduct a scientific investigation into one of the cryptozoological world's most enduring enigmas. Fine dining, luxury accommodations, the unknown. The unknown was not supposed to be part of the itinerary. The unknown was supposed to be a marketing hook, a story told over cocktails, a theme for the evening's entertainment, a reason to charge $15,000 a night for a cruise to a patch of empty ocean where nothing had happened in 100 years. The unknown was not supposed to show up. The first 3 days of the cruise were uneventful. The Meridian Star departed from Durban on a Saturday morning, steaming south along the KwaZulu-Natal coast in weather that was aggressively pleasant. Clear skies, calm seas, a following wind that made the white leather on the upper deck flutter in a way that the passengers found invigorating. The ship's onboard marine biologist, a cheerful, sun-weathered South African named Dr. Marius Nel, gave a series of lectures in the dining room about the 1924 sighting, walking the passengers through the eyewitness accounts, the newspaper coverage, and the subsequent scientific consensus that the creature had been a decomposed whale. Dr. Nel was a good lecturer. He was engaging, funny, and had the particular gift of making complex marine biology accessible to people whose primary educational credential was a trust fund. He showed slides. He showed historical photographs, the famous, grainy images of the white mass on Margate Beach, taken by a local photographer whose name had been lost to history. He explained the concept of a globster, the decomposed remains of a whale, stripped of its identifying features by the action of the sea, leaving behind a shapeless mass of blubber and connective tissue that could be mistaken for anything. The passengers listened. They drank their single malts. They nodded. They believed him because believing him was easy and comfortable and required no revision of their understanding of the world. The creature had been a whale. The white fur had been connective tissue. The trunk had been a jaw. The tail had been a fluke. Everything had an explanation. The ocean was rational. The unknown was a marketing hook. The $15,000 a night was well spent. On the third evening, the Meridian Star reached the coordinates. The ship dropped anchor, or rather, dynamic positioning thrusters engaged, holding the vessel in place over a patch of open ocean that was, to all appearances, identical to every other patch of open ocean in the Indian Ocean. The water was blue. The sky was clear. The horizon was empty. There was nothing here. There had never been anything here. The creature in 1924 had been a whale. The unknown was a marketing hook. Everything was fine. The passengers gathered on the upper deck for a sunset cocktail reception. The bar was open. The string quartet played Vivaldi. The ocean stretched in every direction, vast and empty and profoundly indifferent. Callie van der Merwe was not on the ship. She was in the archive room of the Margate Museum, reading a dead man's diary and growing increasingly certain that the 80 people on the Meridian Star were in the presence of something that Huguenot had warned them about 100 years too early. The sonar operator on the Meridian Star was a young woman named Liesl Venter. She was 24, recently qualified, and on her first contract as a civilian sonar technician after 4 years in the South African Navy. She was good at her job. She was meticulous, focused, and had the particular kind of patience that sonar work demanded, the ability to stare at a screen for hours, watching the same gray-green sweep, the same empty ocean floor, the same unchanging acoustic landscape, and to remain alert enough to notice the anomaly when it appeared. It appeared at 11:47 p.m. on the third night. Liesl was in the sonar room, a small dark space on the lower deck behind the bridge filled with equipment racks and lit by the glow of 3 monitors. She was drinking coffee. She was watching the sweep. The ocean floor was flat, mud and silt, unremarkable, the kind of bottom that sonar operators call boring because boring is safe and safe is good. The contact appeared on the portside sweep. A shape, dense, solid, not the diffuse, ambiguous return of a school of fish or a thermal layer. A hard return, the kind that means something big, something with mass, something that reflects sound the way a wall reflects light. Liesl adjusted the gain. She narrowed the sweep. She switched to the high-frequency channel for better resolution. The shape resolved. It was large, very large. The sonar gave her a size estimate based on the strength of the return and the spread of the acoustic shadow, approximately 45 feet long, 15 feet in diameter. It was below the ship, not directly beneath but offset to the east by about 200 yards. It was at a depth of 80 feet. It was not moving. Liesl watched it. She watched it for 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes the shape did not move. It sat on the sonar screen like a stone on a radar display, solid, present, and utterly still. She called the bridge. "Bridge sonar, I have a contact. Large, 200 yards east, depth 80 feet, no movement." "Copy sonar, probably a wreck. There are several in this area from the Second World War. Can you classify?" "Negative, the return is unusual. The shape doesn't match any wreck profile I've seen. It's elongated, but the cross-section is irregular. It's not a ship. It's not a submarine. It's—" Liesl paused. She looked at the screen. The shape had changed, not its position, its shape. In the 10 minutes since she'd first detected it, the contact had grown. It was now 50 feet long. The cross-section had expanded. The acoustic return was stronger. "Bridge, the contact is growing." "Growing." "It's larger than it was 10 minutes ago. It's expanding." There was a pause on the bridge. The kind of pause that happens when a professional hears something that does not fit into the professional's framework and needs a moment to decide whether to take it seriously. "Keep monitoring. I'll send the watch officer down." Liesl kept monitoring. The shape grew, 55 feet, 60 feet, 65 feet. It was not moving laterally, no change in position, no change in depth, but it was expanding outward in all directions like a balloon being inflated, or like a thing that was waking up. At 12:03 a.m. the shape moved. Not expanded, moved, laterally toward the ship. The entire mass, now 70 feet long, 20 feet in diameter, shifted position. It rose from 80 feet to 60 feet. It closed 50 yards of horizontal distance in 3 seconds. It was not drifting. It was not being carried by a current. It was swimming, or rather it was tracking. The movement was directional, purposeful, oriented directly toward the Meridian Star, and it was fast, faster than a whale, faster than a submarine, faster than anything that size should be. "Bridge sonar, the contact is moving. It's moving toward us. Range 150 yards and closing, depth 60 feet and rising." The bridge responded. The captain, Johann Erasmus, a veteran of 30 years at sea, came on the radio. His voice was calm and controlled and had the particular flatness of a man who is processing information that he does not like, but that he does not have the luxury of not processing. Sonar bridge. Give me a continuous bearing and range update. Bridge, sonar, bearing 090, range 120 yards, depth 40 feet, speed. Speed is 6 knots and accelerating. Accelerating. 8 knots, 10, 12, it's accelerating fast, range 80 yards, depth 20 feet. Captain, it's coming to the surface. Sound the general alarm. The alarm went through the ship like a blade. The passengers on the upper deck, most of them in bed, the cocktail reception long since ended, were jolted awake by a sound that was designed to jolt. A high, warbling, unmistakable tone that said, in every language and every culture, something is wrong. The lights in the corridors switched from warm amber to harsh white. The crew, trained for emergencies that the training had never actually specified, moved to their stations with the mechanical, slightly confused efficiency of people, following a script they had rehearsed but never expected to perform. Callie Van der Merwe was not on the ship, but Sasha Cunning was. Sasha had been invited on the cruise as a heritage consultant, a nominal title that meant she was there to provide historical context for the passengers, to tell them about the 1924 sighting, to be the academic face of what was, in every other respect, a floating luxury hotel. She had been in her cabin, a small but well-appointed room on the second deck, with a porthole and a white linen duvet and a complimentary bottle of champagne that she had not opened, when the alarm sounded. She got up, she put on her shoes, she opened her cabin door. The corridor was full of people, passengers in robes and slippers, their faces puffy with interrupted sleep, their expressions ranging from annoyed to alarmed. Crew members in their white uniforms, directing traffic, speaking in the clipped, efficient phrases of people who are following a procedure. Please proceed to the dining room. Please proceed to the dining room. Please remain calm. Sasha proceeded to the dining room. She sat at a table with a glass of water and her phone, which had no signal, because they were 100 miles from the nearest cell tower, and she waited, and the ship trembled. The trembling was subtle at first, a vibration in the deck plates, a hum in the walls, a faint, rhythmic pulse that was below the threshold of hearing but above the threshold of feeling. It was the kind of vibration that a ship produces when its engines are working hard, when the thrusters are firing, when the hull is straining against something. But the ship was at anchor. The thrusters were in dynamic positioning mode. They should not have been working hard. They should have been making the gentle, periodic corrections that kept the ship in place, not the sustained, straining effort that was now vibrating through the hull. Sasha put her hand on the table. The table was shaking. The water in her glass was trembling. The vibration was coming from outside the ship, from the water, from the hull, from something that was in contact with the hull and was transmitting a vibration through it. At 12:15 a.m., the power went out. The darkness was total, not the dimmed, emergency lighting darkness of a ship that has switched to backup power. Total. Black. The kind of darkness that exists at the bottom of the ocean, where there is no sun and no moon and no artificial light, where the only illumination is the faint, bioluminescent glow of things that have evolved to make their own light because no other light will ever reach them. The emergency lights came on. They were dim, orange, battery-powered, the minimum illumination required to prevent panic and enable evacuation. They cast the dining room in a sulphurous, subterranean light that made the white leather look like old bone, and the passengers' faces look like the faces of people who were already dead and did not know it yet. The vibration increased. It was no longer subtle. The deck was shaking. The tables were rattling. The glasses were sliding. A bottle of wine fell off a table and shattered on the floor, and the sound of it, sharp, domestic, mundane, was so incongruous with the situation that several passengers screamed. The captain's voice came over the intercom. It was calm. It was professional. It was the voice of a man who was standing on a bridge that was dark and shaking, and who was looking at a sonar screen that was showing him something that his 30 years at sea had not prepared him to see. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We are experiencing a situation with the ship systems. I ask you to remain in the dining room and to remain calm. The crew is assessing the situation. We will provide updates as soon as we have more information. The intercom clicked off. The vibration continued. And then through the hull, through the steel walls of the dining room, through the water on the other side of the steel, came a sound. It was not the sound of the vibration. It was not mechanical. It was not the engines or the thrusters or the generators. It was organic. A low, resonant, sustained tone that came from the water the way a whale's song comes from the water, but deeper, longer, more organized. It had a structure. It had a rhythm. It had the quality of language, not a human language, not an animal call, but something that used the medium of sound to convey information, to say something, to announce something. The passengers heard it. The crew heard it. Sasha heard it. And Sasha, who had spent the last 3 days reading Huguenot's diary in the ship's small library, who had memorized the descriptions and the dates, and the handwriting of a man who had watched a creature wake up on a beach 100 years ago, recognized the sound. It was not a whale's song. It was not a fish. It was not anything that the ocean was supposed to contain. It was the sound of Trunko. And Trunko was awake. The breach happened at 12:23 a.m. Sasha was in the dining room with the passengers. She could feel the vibration through the soles of her shoes. She could hear the sound through the walls. And then she heard something else, a different sound, a sound that was not vibration and not song but impact. A single, percussive, metallic boom that came from below decks, from the engine room, from the part of the ship that was below the waterline, and that was, she realized with a cold, sinking, absolute certainty, the part of the ship that was in direct contact with the thing in the water. The boom was followed by a sound that was worse, the sound of steel bending, not breaking, bending. The slow, groaning, elastic deformation of a hull plate that was being pushed inward by a force that was distributed over a wide area, but that was, in its totality, beyond anything that the hull had been designed to withstand. Then the water came. It came through a breach in the hull that was not a hole but a puncture, a single, circular opening in the steel plating of the lower deck, approximately 2 feet in diameter, punched through the metal with a clean, surgical precision that was not the result of an explosion or a collision, but of a tool. The creature's trunk, the 5-foot, muscular, flexible appendage that Huguenot had described in his diary, and that the 1924 witnesses had compared to an elephant's, had been used as a battering ram. It had punched through the hull the way a finger punches through wet paper. The water that entered through the breach was not the simple, gravitational flow of seawater through a hole. It was directed. It came in with force, with purpose, with a velocity that suggested suction rather than pressure, as though the breach were not an opening but a vacuum, and the water and everything in the water was being pulled through it. 2 crew members were in the corridor outside the engine room when the breach occurred. They were swept off their feet. The water took them, not flooded over them, not the passive, rising water of a ship taking on water through a hole. Took them, pulled them, sucked them through the breach and into the dark, freezing water on the other side of the hull, and the last thing they heard was the sound of the sea, and the sea was not silent, and the sea was not empty, and the sea was not safe. The alarms changed. The general alarm, the warbling "everything is wrong" tone, was replaced by the damage control alarm, a deeper, more urgent, more specific sound that said, "The ship is breached, the water is coming in, and you need to move." The passengers panicked. The word panic is overused and underappreciated. Panic is not fear. Panic is the complete, catastrophic failure of the social and cognitive systems that allow human beings to function in groups. It is the moment when the contract between individuals dissolves and every person becomes a single, solitary animal with a single, solitary imperative. Get out. They ran, they shoved, they screamed. The dining room became a stampede, not toward the exits, which were clearly marked and lit by the emergency lights, but toward the upper deck, the open air, the sky, because every animal that has ever lived knows in the deepest part of its brain that when the water comes, you go up. Sasha went up. She went with the crowd, not because she wanted to, but because the crowd carried her, the way a river carries a leaf, not by force but by the overwhelming, irresistible, simple physics of too many bodies moving in the same direction. She was pushed up the stairs. She was pushed through the doors. She was pushed onto the upper deck, where the air was cold and the sky was clear and the stars were bright and the ocean was black, and the ship was listing. Listing? The meridian star was tilting. Not rapidly, not the dramatic, cinematic tilt of a sinking ship in a movie. Slowly. Gradually. The deck was at an angle of perhaps 5 degrees, enough to make the tables slide, enough to make the chairs roll, enough to make the passengers grab the railings and hold on. The ship was being pulled down. Not by water in the hull, although water was in the hull, flooding the lower decks, filling the engine room, drowning the generators, killing the power. The ship was being pulled down by something outside it. Something that had wrapped itself around the hull and was coiling. Sasha felt it before she saw it. The vibration changed. The shaking became a squeezing, a rhythmic, compressive force that tightened around the hull in waves, like a python around a pig, and the ship groaned and the steel screamed, and the deck tilted another degree, and another. Then she saw it. It came out of the water on the port side, not leaping, rising. The way a whale rises when it breaches, the slow, massive, gravitational surfacing of a body that has been below and is now coming above. But this body was not a whale. It was 47 feet long. It was covered in white. White fur, white fibers, white tendrils that hung from its body like the tentacles of a jellyfish, trailing in the water, glowing faintly with a bioluminescence that was not the cold, blue glow of plankton but a warm, golden, mammalian glow. The glow of something alive in a way that challenged the definition of the word. It had a trunk, 5 feet long, muscular, flexible, rising from the front of its body like the trunk of an elephant but thicker, more articulated, ending in a tip that was not a finger but a mouth. A small, circular, sphincter-like opening that contracted and dilated as it surfaced, tasting the air, reading the wind, sensing. It had a tail, 10 feet long, flat, broad, the tail that the 1924 witnesses had compared to a lobster's, but it was not a crustacean's tail. It was a weapon, a broad, muscular appendage that was, even now, smashing against the hull of the Meridian star with a force that sent vibrations through the entire ship, and that, Sasha realized with a horror that went beyond anything she had ever felt or imagined, was the source of the squeezing. The tail was wrapped around the hull. The body was coiled, and the creature was constricting. The passengers on the upper deck saw it. 62 passengers and most of the crew, standing on the tilted deck of a luxury cruise ship, staring at a creature that had been dismissed as a decomposed whale for 100 years, and that was now, in the clear, starlit, unforgiving light of the Indian Ocean night, very much alive and very much present and very much here. Someone screamed, then everyone screamed. The sound of 80 people screaming at the same time is not a sound. It is a force, a physical, atmospheric pressure that pushes against the air and the eardrums and the mind, and it went up into the sky and out over the water and it reached the creature. And the creature's trunk turned toward the sound, and the tip of the trunk dilated, and the white fibers on its body bristled, extending outward, reaching toward the sound, reaching toward the screams, reaching toward the warmth and the movement and the life that was coming from the ship. The fibers touched the hull. Where they touched, they adhered. They stuck to the steel the way a spider's web sticks to a surface, not with glue but with attachment, with a molecular bond that was not mechanical but biological. The fibers spread. From the point of contact they extended, along the hull, up the sides, over the railings, onto the deck. They were climbing aboard. The first person touched by a fiber was a crew member named Pieter. He was standing at the port rail, directing passengers to the starboard side, away from the creature. A single white fiber, long, thin, almost invisible against the dark steel of the rail, brushed the back of his hand. He flinched. He looked at his hand. The fiber was clinging to his skin, not wrapped around it, not coiled, but flat against it, the way a strip of tape lies flat against a surface. He tried to brush it off. His fingers passed over it. It did not move. It was not on his skin. It was in his skin, penetrating the surface, embedding itself in the epidermis, bonding with the tissue the way it had bonded with the steel. He screamed. He grabbed the fiber with his other hand and pulled. The fiber came away from his skin with a sound that was not a sound but a sensation, a wet, tearing, rooted sensation, like pulling a hair from a follicle, except that the hair was a nerve and the follicle was his entire hand. The fiber came free. His hand was bleeding, not profusely, a slow, steady ooze from the place where the fiber had been, a wound that was not a cut but a removal, as though a part of his skin had been taken, and in the place where it had been, the flesh was raw and pink and aware, not painful in the conventional sense, but sensitive, hypersensitive, as though the nerve endings in the exposed tissue were operating at a frequency that they had not been designed for. He stumbled backward. He looked at his hand. The wound was pulsing, in time with the creature's bioluminescence, in time with the vibration in the deck, in time with the sound that was still coming from the water, the low, resonant, organized tone that was not a song but a signal. The creature was tagging him. The fiber that he had pulled from his hand lay on the deck. It was still moving, still pulsing, and from the point where it had touched his skin, a faint, white, thread-like fiber was growing, extending from the wound, pushing outward from the damaged tissue, as though the fiber had left a seed in his flesh and the seed was germinating. Pieter was the first, he was not the last. The fibers spread across the deck like frost. They came over the rails, over the gunnels, up the sides of the superstructure, thin, white, almost invisible, glowing faintly with the creature's bioluminescence. They moved with a speed that was not fast but was inevitable, the slow, irresistible advance of something that had all the time in the world and that knew, with the absolute certainty of a thing that had been alive for a very long time, that the people on the ship had nowhere to go. Passengers retreated. They moved to the starboard side, to the aft deck, to the bow, anywhere away from the fibers. But the fibers were coming from all sides now. The creature was not just on the port side. It had coiled around the ship, its 47-foot body wrapped around the hull in a loose, constricting spiral, and from every point of contact the fibers were advancing. The lobster tail smashed through a bulkhead. The sound was catastrophic, explosive, metallic, the sound of steel being deformed by a force that was not sharp but blunt, a broad, flat impact that crumpled the bulkhead the way a foot crumples a can. The bulkhead collapsed inward, and behind it the corridor that led to the lower decks was exposed, flooded, dark, and full of water that was not empty. The water was full of fibers, white, trailing, pulsing fibers that drifted in the flooded corridor like the tentacles of an anemone, touching the walls, touching the ceiling, touching the doors, and everywhere they touched, they adhered, and from the point of adherence they spread. The lower decks were lost. The engine room was flooded. The generators were dead. The ship was dark except for the emergency lights, and the emergency lights were beginning to fail as the batteries ran down, and the water rose, and the fibers spread, and the creature squeezed, and the people on the upper deck realized, with the slow, terrible, dawning horror of people who have been living in a dream and who are waking up, that they were not on a cruise ship. They were in a nest. The ship was dying. Fergus? No, not Fergus. This was not the Nandi Hills. This was the Indian Ocean, and the ship was the Meridian Star, and it was dying the way a large animal dies, slowly, in stages, each system failing in sequence, each failure triggering the next, the whole magnificent, polished, teak-canned white leather edifice of luxury collapsing into the fundamental reality of a steel box in the water with something coiled around it. The hull was breached in 3 places now. The trunk had punched through the lower deck twice, 2 clean, circular punctures, each 2 feet in diameter, each creating a vacuum that sucked seawater and anything in the seawater's path into the flooded interior. The third breach was larger, not a puncture but a tear, where the lobster tail had smashed through a bulkhead and the steel had ripped along its seams, opening a gash that was 6 feet long and that was, even now, widening as the water pressure pushed the torn edges apart. The ship was listing 15 degrees to port. The deck was a ramp. The tables, the chairs, the bar, the string quartet's music stands, all of it had slid to the port rail and was piled there in a tangle of white leather and polished teak that was, in its own way, a monument to the fragility of human comfort. The passengers were on the starboard side. 60 of them, 2 had been lost in the initial breach, swept into the flooded lower decks by the vacuum, and they were clustered at the rail, holding on, pressing against each other, the mass of their bodies a single, trembling, animal thing that moved and breathed and panicked as a unit. The fibers were on the deck. They had spread from the port side to the center line. They were thin, white, almost invisible against the dark non-slip surface of the deck, and they moved with the slow, exploratory patience of things that were not hunting but sampling, touching, tasting, recording. Every fiber was a nerve. Every nerve was connected to the creature, and the creature was learning. It was learning the ship, the shape of it, the size of it, the number of warm bodies on it, the distribution of weight, the structural weak points. The creature's fibers were mapping the meridian star the way a spider's web maps a forest, by touch, by contact, by the patient, exhaustive, comprehensive process of reaching out and feeling every surface and recording every vibration and integrating all of it into a single, coherent, 3-dimensional model of the thing it had caught. And then it would eat it. Not eat clear. The creature did not eat for hunger. It killed for territory. The ship was in its space. The people were in its space. And the creature, which had been dormant for 100 years and which had spent those 100 years extending its sensory network through the water and the sand and the salt, was now awake, and it was clearing its territory the way any territorial animal clears its territory, by removing the intruders. Sasha was at the starboard rail, pressed between a heavy-set man in a bathrobe and a woman who was weeping with a steady, mechanical consistency that was more frightening than screaming, because screaming at least implied the capacity for response, while the weeping implied a surrender so complete that the body had bypassed the brain and was simply expressing, in the most primitive way available to it, the fact that it was in a situation it could not process. Sasha was processing. She was processing because she had read Huguenot's diary, and the diary had given her a framework, a context, a vocabulary, a set of expectations that, while terrifying, were at least shaped. The other passengers had no framework. They had a marketing brochure and Dr. Nell's lecture about globsters and a $15,000 a night expectation of safety that had been catastrophically betrayed. They were in the dark, in every sense. Sasha was in the dark in only some senses. She knew what the creature was. She knew what the fibers were. She knew what the trunk was for and what the tail was for and what the white fur was for. She knew these things because a dead man had written them down 100 years ago and she had read them, and the reading had given her the only thing that mattered in a situation like this. Not comfort, not hope, but information. She looked at the fibers on the deck. She looked at the creature's body, coiled around the hull, its white fur glowing in the starlight. She looked at the trunk, rising from the water, its tip dilating and contracting, tasting the air. She looked at the tail, wrapped around the stern, its broad, flat surface pressed against the steel, the muscles visible beneath the skin, contracting in the slow, rhythmic, constricting pulse that was pulling the ship down. She thought about Huguenot's diary. She thought about the fibers that had grown from the body on the beach, extending, reaching, sensing. She thought about the description of the fur as a sensory organ, a network of nerves that allowed the creature to feel its environment at a distance, to map, to track, to tag. and she thought about the fiber that Callie had found in the drowned man's trachea, the fiber that was still pulsing, the fiber that was not keratin but nerve, the fiber that was part of the creature. The drowned man had been tagged. The fibers had entered his body, not through his skin but through his airway, through the soft, vulnerable tissue of his throat, the place where the air entered and the water entered and the fibers entered, because the fibers were not just sensory organs. They were seeds. They were the creature's reproductive mechanism, its method of extension, its way of being in more than one place at a time. The creature tagged you by embedding a fiber in your tissue, and the fiber grew, and the fiber connected you to the creature's network, and you became part of the network, a node in the system, a point on the map. And the map was how it found you. The creature didn't track by smell or sight or sound. It tracked by network. Every fiber it had ever deposited, in the water, on the sand, in the air, in a drowned man's trachea, was a node in a network that spanned, Sasha realized with a cold, full-body, existential horror, the entire ocean. The creature was not an individual. It was a system, a decentralized, distributed, networked organism that extended its sensory and reproductive apparatus through the medium of the sea, and that had been doing so for 100 years, 1,000, 1,000,000. How long had it been in the water? How long had it been extending its fibers, depositing its seeds, building its network? Huguenot's diary said the creature had been dormant on the beach for 10 days, and had used those 10 days to absorb salt and minerals and warmth. But what had it been doing before it went dormant? And what had it been doing in the 100 years since it went back into the water? It had been growing, extending, connecting. The fibers that Callie had found in the drowned man's trachea were not an anomaly. They were evidence. Evidence that the creature's network had reached the coast, had reached the fishing grounds, had reached the shipping lanes, had reached the people. The drowned man had been a fisherman. He had fallen off a charter vessel, according to the Coast Guard. But Sasha did not believe he had fallen. She believed he had been pulled. Pulled by a fiber that had been deposited in his body long before he entered the water. A fiber that had been growing in his tissue, extending its roots, connecting him to the network, and that had, when the conditions were right, when he was in the water, when the salt and the temperature and the chemical signals aligned, activated, pulled him in, drowned him, and left a fiber in his throat as a calling card, a message to the next person who found it: I am here, I am in the water, and I am awake. Sasha looked at the passengers around her. 60 people. 80, minus the 2 who had been lost, minus the crew members who had been swept into the flooded decks. How many of them had fibers in their bodies? How many of them had been tagged by swimming in the ocean, by breathing the sea air, by eating the fish that had been caught in waters where the creature's fibers had been spreading for 100 years? She looked at the fibers on the deck. She looked at the creature. She looked at the trunk, reaching toward the ship, its tip opening and closing, tasting, sensing, reading the tagged and the untagged, sorting the passengers into 2 categories: those who were part of the network and those who were not. Those who were part of the network would be collected. They were already connected. They were already known. The creature knew their position, their temperature, their heart rate, their fear. It could feel them through the fibers in their bodies the way a spider feels a fly through the vibrations in its web. Those who were not part of the network, the untagged, were a different matter. They were unknown. They were intruders. They were in the creature's territory without permission, without connection, without the bond that the creature used to define the boundary between mine and not mine. The untagged were the ones the creature would kill first. The first death on the upper deck happened at 1:07 a.m. A passenger, later identified as Mr. Hendrik Duplessis, a retired mining executive from Johannesburg, age 68, was standing at the starboard rail, 3 feet from Sasha. He had been calm. He had been quiet. He had been the kind of passenger who, in the face of catastrophe, retreats into the dignity of silence and the posture of composure, and who stands at the rail with his hands on the steel and his face to the sea and his body still, because stillness is the only response to chaos that does not amplify it. A fiber came over the rail. It came from the water, not from the creature's body but from the water itself, from the network of fibers that floated and trailed in the ocean around the ship, the invisible, pervasive, everywhere present web that the creature had been spinning for a century. The fiber was white, thin, almost transparent, and it moved with a directed, purposeful motion that was not the drifting of a passive object but the reaching of a sensory organ. It touched Mr. Duplessis's hand. He looked at it. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. He looked at the fiber on his hand with the expression of a man who has been touched by something he does not understand and who is trying in the last moments of his rational life to understand it. The fiber adhered, it flattened against his skin, and then it sank. It did not cut. It did not pierce. It sank. The way a stone sinks in water, the way a heavy thing sinks in a lighter thing, the fiber simply passed through the surface of his skin and into the tissue beneath, as though his skin were a membrane and the fiber were a thing that existed in a different state of matter, and could pass through solid objects the way light passes through glass. Mr. Duplessis made a sound, not a scream, a gasp, a sharp, involuntary intake of air that was the body's response to a sensation it could not categorize. Not pain, something else, something deeper, the sensation of being entered, of being occupied, of something foreign moving through your tissue the way a root moves through soil, and the soil is you, and the root is not interested in your consent. The fiber grew, inside his hand. Sasha could see it, not through his skin, which was opaque, but by the glow, a faint, golden, bioluminescent light that spread from the point of entry, up his wrist, into his forearm like a vein being filled with light. The fiber was extending itself through his circulatory system, using his own blood vessels as channels, his own veins as highways, spreading through his body the way a vine spreads through a trellis, and the trellis was his vascular system, and the vine was the creature's nerve. Mr. Duplessis's hand began to shake, then his arm, then his shoulder, then his entire body, a fine, rapid, full-body tremor that was not a seizure but a signal, the vibration of a body that was being repurposed, that was being connected, that was being networked. His eyes went wide, his mouth opened, and from his mouth, from the back of his throat, from the place where the airway meets the digestive tract, a white fiber emerged. It was thin, it was small, it was the first growth, the first visible external manifestation of the creature's presence inside a living human body. The fiber emerged from Mr. Duplessis's mouth the way a plant emerges from soil, slowly, steadily, pushing outward, seeking the air, seeking the light, seeking the water. Mr. Duplessis fell. He hit the deck. He convulsed. The fibers grew from his mouth, from his nose, from his ears, from the corners of his eyes, from every orifice and opening that connected his interior to the exterior of his body. They grew with a speed that was not biological but explosive. The rapid, unchecked, cancerous proliferation of a tissue that had no growth limit and no regulatory mechanism, and that was using the nutrients and the moisture and the warmth of a human body as fuel for its own expansion. In 30 seconds, Mr. Duplessis was unrecognizable. His face was covered. His body was covered. He was a white, glowing, pulsing cocoon of fibers that lay on the tilted deck and throbbed in time with the creature's bioluminescence and the creature's song and the creature's heartbeat, and he was not dead. He was not alive. He was incorporated. He was part of the network. He was a node. He was a point on the map. He was the creature. The passengers who had been standing near him scattered. The screaming started again, a single, sustained animal sound that came from 60 throats at once, and that was, Sasha thought, the most honest sound she had ever heard, because it was the sound of human beings confronting, in real time, the reality that they were not at the top of the food chain, that they were not the apex, that they were not the thing the world revolved around, and that the world contained things that were older and larger and more patient and more organized and more alive than anything they had ever imagined or been told or been promised. The slaughter was methodical. The creature did not indiscriminately kill. It did not thrash. It did not rage. It processed. The fibers on the deck reached toward the passengers, slowly, deliberately, each fiber extending toward a specific target, each target selected by a criterion that Sasha could not identify but that she suspected, based on Huguenot's diary and her own observations, had to do with the presence or absence of existing fibers in the passengers' bodies. The tagged were collected first. Those who had fibers in their bodies, deposited by swimming, by eating, by breathing, by the slow, century-long extension of the creature's network into every body of water it could reach, were the first to be touched. The fibers on the deck reached them, adhered, sank, grew. The process was faster in the tagged, seconds instead of minutes, the existing fibers in their bodies acting as anchors, as receptors, as welcoming committees for the new growth. One by one the tagged passengers fell, they convulsed, they were cocooned, they became nodes. The untagged, the people who, by luck or geography or diet or the simple randomness of exposure, did not have fibers in their bodies, were handled differently. The fibers on the deck reached for them, but the contact was not the gentle sinking of a fiber into receptive tissue. It was violent. The fibers wrapped around ankles, around wrists, around necks. They pulled. The untagged were dragged across the deck, toward the port rail, toward the water, toward the creature. The creature's trunk was waiting. The trunk rose from the water, the 5-foot muscular, flexible appendage, and its tip opened, the sphincter dilating to a diameter of perhaps 8 inches, and inside the trunk Sasha could see, in the bioluminescent glow, rows of small, fine tooth-like structures. Not teeth but grippers, tiny, curved, chitinous hooks that lined the interior of the trunk, the way the hooks lined the interior of a lamprey's mouth. The trunk seized the first untagged passenger, a young man, perhaps 25, who had been dragged to the rail by the fibers around his ankles. The trunk wrapped around his torso, the grippers engaged, and the trunk pulled. The young man went over the rail. He screamed. The scream was cut short, not by the water but by the trunk, which contracted around his chest with a force that compressed his rib cage and expelled the air from his lungs in a single, explosive, silent exhalation. He was pulled into the water. He was pulled below the surface. And the water closed over him, and the bioluminescence flashed once, twice, 3 times, and then was still. The trunk rose again. It reached for the next passenger. The ship was sinking. The list had increased to 25 degrees. The starboard rail was now the highest point on the ship, the only point that was above the water, the only place where the passengers could stand without sliding toward the port side, where the fibers were thick and the water was dark and the creature's body was coiled. There were perhaps 30 passengers left. Half the ship's complement, 40 people, had been taken. Some had been cocooned on the deck. Some had been dragged into the water. Some had been swept into the flooded lower decks by the initial breaches and had drowned in the dark, in the cold, in the fibers that filled the corridors like the tentacles of something that had been waiting patiently for 100 years for the ship to come. Sasha was among the 30. She was at the rail, holding on, her knuckles white, her body pressed against the steel. She was not tagged. She knew this because the fibers on the deck had reached for her twice and had not adhered, had brushed her skin and slid away, as though her body were not receptive, as though the network could not find a foothold. She was untagged, and the untagged were being dragged into the water. She needed to think. She needed to think the way Huguenot had thought, not with the rational, scientific, cause-and-effect mind that Dr. Nell had used in his lecture, but with the observational mind, the mind that watched and noted and did not conclude but recorded, that took in the data and let the data speak for itself even when the data was saying something that the mind did not want to hear. The fibers were sensory organs. The creature tracked through the network. The tagged were collected gently. They were already part of the system. The untagged were collected violently. They were intruders, unknowns, things that needed to be cleared. The creature's weakness was its strength. The fibers that allowed it to sense and track and tag were also its vulnerability. They were its eyes, its ears, its skin. Damage the fibers and you blinded it. Block the fibers and you deafened it. Coat the fibers and you numbed it. Sasha thought about the oil. The ship ran on marine diesel. The fuel tanks were in the lower deck, flooded now but not necessarily breached. If the fuel lines were intact, if the fuel had not been contaminated by the seawater, there would be diesel in the lines, pressurized, ready, waiting for an engine that would never start again. Diesel on water makes a film, a thick, viscous, hydrophobic film that coats whatever it touches. If the diesel touched the fibers, if it coated the white, nerve-rich, sensory organs that the creature used to see and hear and feel, the oil would smother them, block the nerves, cut the signals, blind the creature. It was not a plan, it was a desperation, but desperation was all she had. She looked around. The upper deck was chaos, passengers screaming, fibers reaching, the trunk rising and falling. She looked for the fuel access point, the maintenance hatch that would give her access to the fuel lines. It was on the port side, the side where the fibers were thickest, the side where the creature's body was coiled. She would have to cross the deck, through the fibers, through the creature's sensory network, past the trunk, past the tail, through the killing field. She looked at the 30 people around her. They were not soldiers. They were not survivors. They were passengers on a luxury cruise, and they were terrified, and they were dying, and they did not know why. She looked for someone, anyone, who could help her, who could understand what she was about to say and who could act on it. And then she saw Callie. Callie Van der Merwe was not supposed to be on the ship. Callie was in Cape Town, in her laboratory, looking at a fiber under a microscope. But Callie was also on the ship. Not the Callie from the laboratory, not the Callie who had typed the report about the pulsing fiber, but a Callie who had been hired as part of the ship's scientific team. A junior researcher, assigned to collect water samples and plankton data during the cruise, a job that was supposed to be a paid vacation, and that had turned into something else. Callie had been in the ship's small laboratory, a room on the second deck, above the waterline with a porthole and a microscope and a rack of sample jars when the alarm sounded. She had come up to the dining room. She had been pushed onto the upper deck with the rest. She had been at the rail when the creature surfaced. She had not spoken to Sasha. They had not met. They were two women, separated by 20 years of age and 600 miles of coastline, who had each, independently, encountered the same thing. The fiber, the creature, the network, and who were now, by the random, indifferent, relentless logic of a world that did not care about coincidence or narrative, standing 3 feet apart on the deck of a sinking ship. Sasha saw Callie's face. She saw the recognition in it, not of Sasha, but of the situation. Callie was looking at the fibers on the deck with the same expression that Sasha had seen on her own face in the mirror that morning, the expression of someone who has read the data and understood the data and is now living inside the data. "The fuel lines," Sasha said. She had to shout to be heard over the screaming. "The diesel. If we can get to the fuel lines and rupture them, the diesel will coat the fibers. It'll blind the creature." Callie looked at her. Her eyes were wide and bright and focused, the eyes of a scientist who has been presented with a hypothesis and is evaluating it not for plausibility but for testability. "The fuel access is on the port side," Callie said, "through the fibers." "Yes. The fibers will tag us. If they touch our skin, if we can cover ourselves, clothing, anything, we might be able to get through without contact." "Might." "Yes, might." Callie looked at the port side. The fibers were dense there, a mat of white, glowing, pulsing tendrils that covered the deck from the center line to the rail. Beyond the rail, the creature's body was visible, dark, massive, coiled, its fur streaming in the water, its trunk reaching for the next victim. Callie looked at Sasha. Sasha looked at Callie. They did not know each other. They had never met. They had nothing in common except a fiber and a diary and a creature and a ship that was sinking beneath their feet. "Let's go," Callie said. They wrapped themselves in what they could find. Tablecloths from the dining room, torn into strips and wound around their hands and arms and necks. Life jackets, orange, foam, thick, strapped over their bodies covering their torsos. Towels from the spa wrapped around their legs. They were absurd. They were ridiculous. They were two women wrapped in tablecloths and towels on the deck of a sinking cruise ship, preparing to cross a killing field of alien nerve fibers to reach a fuel line that they might or might not be able to rupture. They went. The deck was tilted at 25 degrees. Walking on it was climbing. They went hand over hand along the rail, pulling themselves up the slope, their feet sliding on the non-slip surface that was now covered in fibers. The fibers brushed their legs. The towels caught them. The fibers adhered to the towels, not to their skin, and for a moment Sasha felt a surge of something that was not hope but was adjacent to it, the wild, irrational, magnificent belief that this might actually work. They reached the center line. The fibers were thicker here. The towels on Sasha's legs were coated, white tendrils clinging to the orange fabric, pulsing, reaching, trying to get through. She could feel them through the fabric, not as contact but as pressure, as warmth, as the faint, insistent, searching touch of a thing that was looking for skin and finding only cloth. They reached the port side. The fuel access hatch was in the deck, a steel plate bolted down, marked with a yellow stencil that said Fuel Systems, Authorized Personnel Only. Callie had a multi-tool in her pocket, a small, folding, Leatherman-style tool that she had carried since her Navy days. She opened the pliers. She unbolted the hatch. The fuel lines were below. A nest of pipes and valves and connectors, pressurized, dark, reeking of diesel. The lines were intact. The flooding had not reached this compartment, which was sealed and above the main fuel tanks. Callie reached into the compartment. She found the main supply line, a pipe 2 inches in diameter carrying pressurized diesel from the tanks to the engine room. She wrapped the pliers around the coupling. She turned. The coupling resisted. She turned harder. Her hands were shaking. The ship was shaking. The fibers on the deck behind them were growing, reaching toward them, sensing them, knowing they were there. The coupling broke. Diesel sprayed. It hit her in the face, in her eyes, in her mouth. It was hot and thick, and it smelled like the end of the world. It sprayed out of the broken coupling in a jet that was immediately, violently, directed by the tilt of the ship, downhill, across the port deck, into the water. The diesel hit the water. It spread. A dark, iridescent film expanding across the surface of the ocean, coating the water, coating the fibers, coating the creature's fur. The effect was instantaneous. The fibers on the deck spasmed. They contracted. They pulled back, not from Sasha and Callie, but from everything. Retracting, curling, the tendrils withdrawing from the rails and the bulkheads and the deck and the bodies of the cocooned passengers, pulling back toward the creature's body like the tentacles of a sea anemone that has been touched by something it does not like. The creature's song changed. The low, resonant, organized tone that had been vibrating through the hull shifted, rose in pitch, became discordant, became a sound that was not language but distress. The bioluminescence flickered. The trunk, which had been reaching for a passenger at the rail, pulled back. The tail, which had been constricting the hull, loosened. The oil was coating the fibers. The oil was blocking the nerves. The oil was blinding the creature. Callie grabbed Sasha's arm. They ran. Up the slope, across the center line, back to the starboard rail. The fibers were retreating behind them, pulling back, contracting, the network collapsing as the oil smothered its nodes. They reached the starboard side. The passengers who remained, perhaps 20, the survivors of the slaughter, were at the rail, staring at the water, watching the oil spread, watching the creature's bioluminescence flicker and dim. The creature was letting go. The tail uncoiled. The body disengaged from the hull. The fibers retracted into the water, pulling away from the oil slick, retreating from the surface, diving deep. The creature's body slid off the hull, a massive, white, glistening shape that descended into the dark water and was gone. The ship stopped shaking. The list stabilized. The water was still flooding the lower decks, but the squeezing had stopped, the constricting had stopped, the killing had stopped. The life rafts deployed. The survivors, 20 passengers plus Callie and Sasha, plus a handful of crew who had made it to the upper deck, launched the rafts and climbed in and paddled away from the sinking ship, away from the oil slick, away from the dark water where the creature had been. The rafts were orange. They were the color of safety, of visibility, of the fundamental human conviction that if you can be seen, you can be saved. The survivors climbed into them with the uncoordinated, shaking, barely functional movements of people whose bodies had been running on adrenaline for so long that the adrenaline had become a toxin, and the toxin was wearing off, and what was left was the raw, unmedicated, unfiltered reality of what they had seen, and what had been done to the people around them, and what was still in the water beneath them, below them, around them, everywhere. They paddled. The paddles were small and the rafts were heavy and the ocean was vast and the survivors were few. They paddled with the desperate, mechanical, rhythmless effort of people who do not know where they are going but who know, with the certainty of animals, that away is the only direction that matters. They paddled until the meridian star was a dark shape on the horizon, listing, sinking, going down by the stern, its lights dark, its white leather and polished teak and single malts and string quartet going down with it, going into the water, going into the dark, going into the place where the creature lived and waited and extended its fibers and grew its network and waited for the oil to wear off. 3 days later, a rescue vessel found them. The rafts had drifted 17 miles from the sinking. The survivors were sunburned, dehydrated, and in various states of psychological collapse, but they were alive. 23 people out of 80. The others were dead or cocooned or in the water or part of the network, nodes in a system that spanned the ocean and that had been growing, fiber by fiber, for 100 years. Callie and Sasha were in the same raft. They had not spoken much during the 3 days. There was nothing to say that the situation did not already say for them. They sat in the raft and drank the emergency water and ate the emergency biscuits and watched the ocean and waited for the rescue and tried not to think about the fibers. On the rescue vessel, they were wrapped in blankets, hot soup, warm bunks, the clinical, competent, professional care of a maritime rescue operation. A doctor checked them. A counselor spoke to them. An officer took their statements. Sasha was on the deck of the rescue vessel, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the ocean. The water was blue. The sky was clear. The sun was warm. The world was the world, the rational, explicable, weather-driven, geography-based world that she had lived in for 23 years and that she now knew, with a certainty that was both terrible and clarifying, was only the surface of something much larger and much older and much more patient. Callie came and sat beside her. They were quiet. The ocean stretched in every direction, vast, blue, empty, and full. "Sasha," Callie said. Sasha looked at her. Callie was holding her wrist, her left wrist, the one that had been exposed when the tablecloth slipped during the crossing of the port deck, the one that had been bare for perhaps 3 seconds before she pulled the cloth back up. 3 seconds. That was all it took. 3 seconds of exposed skin in a field of fibers. On Callie's wrist, there was a single white hair. It was very small, very fine, almost invisible against the skin. But it was there and it was moving, a faint, rhythmic, barely perceptible pulsing, in time with the ocean, in time with the tide, in time with something that was out there in the water beyond the horizon, and that was not gone, that had not been defeated, that had merely retreated and waited and let the oil wear off. Sasha looked at Callie's wrist. She looked at the ocean. She looked at the horizon. And there, far out at the limit of vision, at the place where the blue water met the blue sky, she saw a shape, white, small, A flash of bioluminescence that might have been a wave cresting and might have been a reflection and might have been something else. It was moving toward them. It was moving toward them with a speed that was not the speed of a wave or a current or a drifting object. It was the speed of a thing that was swimming, a thing that was tracking, a thing that was following the signal from a single white fiber on the wrist of a woman who had been tagged, and who would never be untagged, and who would carry the creature's mark in her body for the rest of her life, however long or short that life might be. The oil was wearing off. The creature was coming. Sasha looked at Callie. Callie was looking at the horizon. She had seen it too. They looked at each other, and in the looking there was no hope and no plan and no tablecloth or towel or fuel line that could save them this time. There was only the recognition, the same recognition that Huguenot had felt 100 years ago, the same recognition that the thing on the beach had communicated through its diary and its fibers and its 100-year patience. I am here, I am in the water, and I am awake. The white shape grew larger. The ocean parted before it. The sun shone on its fur, and the fur was white, and the white was not the white of a wave or a cloud or a reflection. It was the white of something that had been alive for longer than the concept of white, and that would be alive long after the concept was forgotten. Sasha closed her eyes. The sun was warm. The blanket was warm. The fiber on Callie's wrist was warm. And from the water rising, the sound came. The low, resonant, organized, patient, ancient sound of a creature that had been dormant and that had woken up, and that had found at the edge of its network. The two people who had blinded it and who had run and who had been found and who would be collected, gently, because they were tagged, because they were part of the system, because they were mine. The trunk rose from the water, the fibers reached, the tide came in. And the white tide of Margate did not retreat. The bending pines. The hand was not his own. That much Dennis knew, even in the half-delirium that had overtaken him by the time the first gray fingers of dawn crept through the canopy above. The hand was not his own because his own hands were shaking too violently to hold anything, let alone the blood-slickened wrist of a man who had, until approximately 6 hours ago, been named Marcus Pell. The hand was not his own because Marcus Pell's hand was no longer attached to Marcus Pell, and the stump at the end of it, ragged, gnawed, stripped of skin in perfect concentric circles as though something had peeled it like a fruit, was producing a sound that Dennis would later describe to the hospital psychiatrist as wet humming. Not the humming of a living thing. The humming of tissue that had not yet accepted it was dead. He was using the hand as a lure. He had shoved it, fingers first, into the mouth of a hollow log, and from somewhere deep inside that log came a shrieking, a high, chittering, thoroughly unanimal sound that rose and fell in pitch like a tea kettle made of cartilage. Something small was in there, something that wanted the hand, something that Dennis needed to come out. I didn't laugh, he whispered to the empty air beside him. His voice was a ruin, it cracked on every consonant. I swear I didn't laugh. There was no one to hear him. The 4 other people who had arrived on Andros Island with him 5 days ago were dead, or worse than dead, or something that he did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. The forest around him was silent in a way that forests should never be silent, not the absence of sound, but the suppression of it, as though every living thing within earshot had been told to shut its mouth, and was complying out of something deeper than fear. Dennis pulled the hand out of the log. The shrieking from inside intensified, then stopped abruptly. He tucked the hand into his shirt, against his chest, where the blood was warm and the fingers were still limber enough to curl. He didn't know why he'd kept the hand. He didn't know why he'd kept any of the things he'd kept, the torn fragment of a sleeping bag, the water bottle with teeth marks in the plastic, the one working drone that had captured 43 seconds of footage he would never, under any circumstances, watch again. He kept things because keeping things was what a human being did when the world had stopped making sense. You held on to objects. You assigned them meaning. You pretended that the meaning mattered. He stood up, his knees screamed, everything screamed. The forest didn't. 5 days earlier, the expedition had begun with the kind of confidence that only the profoundly incurious can muster. Marcus Pell stood at the bow of the charter boat as it cut across the shallow turquoise water toward the western coast of Andros Island, his arms spread wide as though he were about to embrace the landmass itself, his face tanned and squinting, and arranged in an expression that Dennis had come to think of as performance awe. Marcus was not in awe of anything. Marcus was calculating views. "This is it," Marcus said, mostly to the GoPro mounted on his chest. "Andros, largest of the Bahamas, least explored, most mythologized. We're here to separate fact from fiction, people. We're here to show the world that what the locals call demons is just biodiversity they don't understand." He turned to face the other 4 members of the team, and the boat rocked with the shift of his weight. Dennis, sitting near the stern with his knees drawn up, watched Marcus with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been hired to do a job and was only now realizing what the job actually entailed. There was Tanya Rule, the team's lead videographer, a tall woman with close-cropped hair and the kind of steady hands that came from years of shooting in war zones. She had been promised a soft gig after 18 months in conflict zones. She had not been told that the gig would involve sleeping in a pine forest on an island where the locals crossed themselves when you mentioned the word Chickcharney. There was Gareth Mooney, the sound engineer, a heavy-set Irishman who had never been outdoors for more than a weekend camping trip in Connemara, and who was already sweating through his 3rd shirt of the morning. Gareth's equipment, 3 directional mics, a parabolic reflector, and a portable mixing board, was worth more than the boat they were standing on. There was Priya Chandrasekharen, the team's researcher and fact-checker, a small, precise woman from Bangalore who had published 2 papers on Caribbean folklore, and who was, Dennis suspected, the only person on the boat besides himself who had actually read anything about Andros Island before signing on. And there was Dennis Farrow himself. He wasn't a cryptid hunter. He wasn't even a filmmaker. He was a location scout, a freelance location scout who had been hired to find atmospheric terrain for the series Marcus was producing. His job was to walk ahead of the group, identify visually interesting locations, and point at things. That was it. That was the sum total of his professional contribution. He pointed at things. The series was called Mythbus, Caribbean, and it was the 3rd season of a franchise that Marcus had built from nothing into a streaming platform darling. The premise was simple. Go to a place where people believed in monsters, find the real explanation for the belief, and film the whole thing with the kind of glossy, gap-year energy that made viewers feel smart for watching. The 1st season had gone to Scotland and debunked the Loch Ness Monster as a combination of boat wakes and oversized eels. The 2nd had gone to the Congo and explained Mokolembembe as a misidentified rhinoceros. The 3rd was heading to the Bahamas, and the target was the Chickcharney. The Chickcharney, Marcus had explained in the pre-production meeting, pronouncing it with the confidence of a man who had learned the word 20 minutes ago, is basically a big owl. That's it. That's the whole myth. The locals think there's this owl-man thing living in the pine forests that curses you if you're rude to it. We're going to go in, show that it's probably just a barn owl or a residual population of the Bahamian owl, maybe the Tytopollens which went extinct in the 1600s, and wrap it up with a nice little segment about how folklore fills ecological gaps. Boom. 12 episodes. Dennis had nodded. He had needed the work. Location scouting in the streaming era was a feast or famine business, and he had been in famine for 3 months. The pay was good. The location was beautiful. He'd been to the Bahamas before briefly for a perfume ad and remembered the water, the impossible blue of it, and the way the light hit the sandbars at low tide and made the ocean look like it was lit from beneath. He had not, at that point, read anything about the Chickcharney. He had not read the Wikipedia article that described it as a 3-foot-tall feathered creature with red eyes, 3-fingered hands, a long prehensile tail, and the ability to rotate its head a full 180 degrees. He had not read the accounts from Andros Islanders, who described finding pine trees with their crowns bent and tied together with vine and resin, forming a kind of nest that no wind and no human hands could have shaped. He had not read the single sentence that would have changed his mind about the entire trip, the sentence spoken by an elderly Andros fisherman to a folklore researcher in 1973, and recorded in a journal that Priya had in fact read. "You do not find the Chickcharney finds you, and if you laughed when you found it, you will not laugh again." None of this was in Dennis's mind, as the boat scraped against the limestone gravel of the western shore, and the five of them stepped onto Andros Island. The interior of Andros is not what tourists imagine when they think of the Bahamas. There are no pink sand beaches in the interior, no rum punch, no steel drums. The interior is a vast, largely uninhabited expanse of pine barrens, mangrove swamps, and freshwater blue holes that connect to the ocean through subterranean limestone channels. The pines are Caribbean/pine, tall, straight, boringly symmetrical, the kind of tree you wouldn't look twice at if you saw it in a municipal parking lot. But in the interior, where the soil is thin and the limestone pokes through like bones, the pines grow denser, and the canopy closes overhead, and the light that filters through is green and aqueous, and the silence begins. It was a 2-hour drive from the coast to the edge of the pine barrens, and then a 4-hour hike to the area where Marcus wanted to set up base camp. The road, such as it was, ended at a logging trail that hadn't been used in decades. After that, it was foot traffic only. Kirk, their local guide, a wiry, quiet Bahamian man in his late 50s, who had been hired through a Nassau-based outfitters and who had, Dennis noticed, tried to decline the job 3 separate times before accepting, stopped at the edge of the logging trail and turned to face the group. "I go to here," Kirk said. He pointed at the trail, then at the ground behind him. "Not further, you go in, you come back out, same trail, same way. You understand?" Marcus was already walking. "We understand, Kirk. We'll be fine. We've got GPS, satellite phones, emergency beacons. We're not going to get lost." Kirk didn't move. He stood at the trailhead with his hands in his pockets and watched them file past. When Dennis passed him, last in line, as always, Kirk caught his arm. His grip was startlingly strong. "Listen," Kirk said. His voice was low, not conspiratorial but careful, the way someone speaks when they are giving you the last piece of advice they will ever give you. "When you in the pine, you be quiet, you be respectful. You do not touch the trees that are bent. You do not take nothing. You do not laugh at nothing you hear. You understand me?" Dennis looked at him. There was no performance in Kirk's face, no drama, no cryptid hunter theatrics. There was the calm, bone-deep certainty of a man who had grown up on this island and who knew, in the way that a person knows the back of their own hand, that there were things in the pine barrens that did not appear on any map. "I understand," Dennis said. Kirk let go of his arm. "Then you go, and when you come back I be here if you come back." Dennis followed the others into the trees. The first day was, by any objective measure, beautiful. The pine barrens of Andros have a stark, monotonous beauty, the kind of landscape that becomes either meditative or maddening depending on your temperament. The trees are evenly spaced, the undergrowth is sparse, and the ground is a carpet of brown needles and white limestone gravel that crunches softly underfoot. The air smells of resin and salt and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. Marcus was in his element. He strode through the forest with the GoPro recording everything, narrating in his presenter voice. That slightly too loud, slightly too enthusiastic tone that streaming hosts use when they're performing discovery rather than experiencing it. "Okay, so this is it. This is the Pine Barren. You can see why people would think there's something out here. It's dense, it's remote, there's no cell service, and the canopy plays tricks on the light. You see shapes in the shadows, you hear sounds you can't identify, and your brain fills in the gaps. classic cryptid territory. Tanya filmed him with the Steadicam, her face neutral. Gareth had his parabolic reflector out, sweeping it across the canopy, headphones on, listening to the soundscape of the forest. Even Priya was taking notes, her handwriting small and meticulous in a leather-bound field journal. Dennis walked ahead, doing his job. He was looking for hero locations, areas with visual drama that could serve as backdrops for interviews or reenactments, a deadfall with interesting root structures, a blue hole with crystalline water, a clearing where the canopy opened up and the sky was visible. He found the blue hole first. It was about 100 meters off the main trail, nestled in a slight depression surrounded by saw palmettos. The water was perfectly clear and perfectly still, and it was the deepest blue Dennis had ever seen. Not the blue of the ocean, which is a diffuse, sunlit blue, but a saturated, almost fluorescent blue that seemed to glow from within. He knelt at the edge and looked down. The hole was bottomless. The limestone walls descended into darkness, and the water, despite its clarity, absorbed light completely past about 20 feet. It was like staring into a hole in the world. Something moved down there. Not a fish, not a shadow, something that displaced the water in a way that suggested mass. Dennis leaned closer. His reflection stared back at him, warped by the slight ripple, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought the reflection was looking at him with more interest than a reflection should. He stood up quickly. His heart was hammering and he felt foolish. It was water. It was a hole in the ground filled with water. The light was playing tricks. He was a location scout, not a ghost hunter. He went back to the group and told Marcus about the blue hole. Marcus was delighted. Perfect. We'll film the intro there tomorrow. Good establishing shot. They made camp in a small clearing as the afternoon light began to angle through the canopy. The tents went up. The generator was started. Gareth set up his mixing board and began recording the ambient soundscape for later use in post-production. Tanya charged batteries. Priya read. Marcus paced the clearing, talking on the satellite phone to his producer back in Los Angeles, his voice carrying through the trees with the kind of casual arrogance that assumed the forest was just a backdrop, and not, as Kirk would have put it, a place with its own opinions. Dennis sat on a fallen log and ate a protein bar and watched the light change. As the sun dropped lower, the shadows lengthened, and the pine trunks threw themselves across the ground like prison bars. The forest, which had been neutral all day, neither welcoming nor hostile, began to shift. It was subtle, a change in the quality of the silence. The wind, which had been a gentle, constant presence, began to come in intermittent gusts, and between the gusts there were pauses that felt deliberate, as though the forest were listening to itself. He noticed something else, too. The birds had stopped. All day there had been a background chatter, the distant call of Bahama parrots, the chatter of warblers, the occasional low hoot of a barn owl in its roost. Now, as the light went amber and the shadows went long, the bird song had ceased entirely. The only sound was the generator and Marcus's voice. "Hey, Gareth," Dennis called. "You picking up anything on the mics?" Gareth pulled one earphone off his head and listened. He frowned. "No, nothing. That's weird. There should be at least insect noise, crickets, frogs from the blue hole, but I'm getting absolute zero. Zero. Zero, dead air, like someone turned off the ambient mic." Gareth put the earphone back on and adjusted the gain on his board. The needles didn't move. The forest was, as far as the microphones could detect, completely silent. Dennis looked up into the canopy. The pine branches were still. No wind. No movement. The last of the sunlight was caught in the uppermost branches, and for a moment the tree crowns looked like they were on fire, orange and gold against the darkening sky. And then one of the crowns moved, not swayed in the wind, moved, laterally, sideways, as though something had grabbed it and pulled it gently to one side. Dennis stared. The movement stopped. The crown was back in its original position. He He blinked. He told himself it was the light. He told himself it was fatigue. He ate his protein bar and said nothing. The second day was when they found the bending pines. Dennis had been scouting ahead again, following a deer trail that wound through the pines toward the northeast. The trail was faint, barely a depression in the needle carpet, but it was something to follow, and following things was easier than navigating by GPS through a forest where every tree looked the same. He smelled it before he saw it. The smell was resin, but not the clean, sharp smell of pine sap. This was darker, richer, almost organic, like amber that had been heated over a flame. There was something else mixed in, a musk, faint but unmistakable, the smell of a living thing that had been in the same place for a very long time. He pushed through a screen of saw palmettos and stopped. 2 pine trees, each at least 80 feet tall, stood in a small clearing. Their trunks were straight and unremarkable, but their crowns, the uppermost 20 feet of each tree, had been bent, not broken, not snapped by wind or storm. Bent slowly and with tremendous force, until the 2 crowns curved toward each other and met, and where they met, they had been bound together with thick coils of vine and a dark, amber-colored resin that had hardened into a natural cement. The result was an arch, a living arch of pine. The 2 trees bent into each other like hands clasped in prayer. The space beneath the arch was dark, not shadowed dark. Dark in the way that the blue hole had been dark, a deliberate, intentional darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely block it. The resin on the bound crowns glistened even in the dim forest light, and the vine coils were tight and purposeful, woven with a complexity that no storm, no animal, no natural process could replicate. Dennis felt his stomach drop. Not fear, not yet, something more fundamental, the recognition of design, of intent. Whatever had done this had done it deliberately, carefully, and with a purpose that Dennis could feel but not articulate. This was not a nest in the way a bird builds a nest. This was a structure, a monument, a door. He stood there for a long time. He should have turned around. He should have gone back to the group and told them what he'd found and let Priya, who understood the folklore, explain why they should not go anywhere near it. But he was a location scout, and this was the most visually arresting thing he had ever seen, and the instinct to catalog and report was stronger than the instinct to flee. He went back to camp. "You need to see this," he told Marcus. Marcus grabbed the GoPro, and Tanya grabbed the Steadicam, and Gareth grabbed the parabolic mic, and Priya grabbed her field journal, and they all followed Dennis through the forest to the clearing with the bending pines. The reaction was immediate, and exactly what Dennis should have predicted. "Holy shit," Marcus said, and his voice was not his presenter voice. It was the voice of a man who had just seen something he could not immediately monetize, and the transition between those 2 states took approximately 3 seconds. "This is incredible. This is the money shot. Tanya, are you getting this?" Tanya was already filming. The Steadicam glided smoothly as she circled the arch, capturing it from multiple angles. The camera loved the bending pines. The contrast between the straight, boring trunks and the curved, bound crowns was visually perfect, symmetrical, strange, and deeply unsettling in a way that the lens amplified. "This is a Chickcharney nest," Priya said. She had her field journal open and was comparing the structure in front of her to the descriptions she had read. "The folklore says the Chickcharney builds its nest by tying the tops of pine trees together. This matches exactly. Marcus, we should be careful. This is." Careful? Marcus was already walking toward the arch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folding knife, a gerber with a serrated edge, the kind of knife men buy when they want to seem prepared but actually just want to seem like the kind of man who carries a knife. "This is a nest, like an actual nest. What's inside?" "We don't know what's inside," Priya said. Her voice was tight. "That's the point. The locals consider these structures sacred. Disturbing them is." "Superstition," Marcus said. He was standing directly beneath the arch now, looking up at the bound crowns. The resin glistened above him like dark honey. It's a nest made by animals, probably birds, maybe some kind of communal roosting behavior we haven't documented yet. It's not sacred, Priya, it's biology. He reached up and touched the trunk of one of the bent pines. Then he opened his knife. "What are you doing?" Dennis asked. Marcus pressed the blade against the bark of the tree and began to carve. The sound was loud in the silence of the clearing, the scratch of steel on wood, the peel of bark curling away from the blade. He carved 2 letters, M.P. Marcus Pell, his initials, 12 inches tall, cut deep into the living wood. "Tagging," Marcus said, grinning. "So when this footage goes viral, everyone knows who found it first." Dennis felt the air change. It was not a temperature change. It was not a pressure change. It was something else, a shift in the quality of the silence, a tightening, as though the clearing had drawn a breath and was holding it. The resin above Marcus's head seemed to darken. The shadows beneath the arch seemed to deepen. "Marcus," Priya said, and her voice was very quiet and very controlled. "Please stop." Marcus finished the carving and stepped back. He wiped the blade on his pants and folded the knife. "Done. Let's get some drone footage. Gareth, can you get the parabolic up to the crown? I want to hear if there's anything moving up there." Gareth extended the boom pole with the parabolic reflector and raised it toward the bound crowns. He put the headphones on. He listened. His face changed. The color left it in a slow, tidal creep, starting at his neck and moving upward, until his freckles stood out like flecks of copper on white paper. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He pulled the headphones off and held them away from his head as though they were hot. "What?" Marcus said. "What do you hear?" Gareth looked at him. His eyes were wide and wet, and his jaw was working as though he were trying to chew through a word he couldn't swallow. "Heartbeat," he said. "I hear a heartbeat, coming from the trees." Marcus laughed. That was the thing Dennis would remember later in the hollow log with the hand that was not his own. Marcus laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, or a dismissive laugh, or even a particularly loud laugh. It was a short, sharp exhalation through the nose, a heh, the kind of sound a man makes when he hears something he doesn't believe and wants everyone to know he doesn't believe it. It was the laugh of a man who had spent his entire career surrounded by things he didn't believe, and who had built his entire identity on the certainty that the world was exactly as mundane as he needed it to be. Marcus laughed, and the forest heard him. Dennis knew this because the forest changed. Not visibly, not audibly. The change was infrastructural, like the moment when a building's heating system switches on and you can't point to where the sound is coming from, but you know, with the animal part of your brain, that something has shifted in the bones of the place where you're standing. Gareth packed up the parabolic reflector with hands that shook. Tanya lowered the Steadicam. Priya was already walking back toward camp. Dennis followed her. Marcus stayed beneath the arch for another 10 minutes, taking selfies, narrating to the GoPro, completely oblivious to the fact that the quality of the light around him had changed. The shadows beneath the arch were no longer the same color as the shadows in the rest of the clearing. They were darker, they were denser, and they were moving, not with wind, but with something that had a pulse. They returned to camp in silence. Gareth was white. Tanya was tight-lipped. Priya walked fast. Marcus was the only one who spoke, and he spoke about drone angles and lighting schedules and narrative arcs. Dennis walked behind the group, and as he walked, he looked back over his shoulder at the bending pines. The arch was still there. The bound crowns were still there, but something was different. The gap between the 2 trunks, the space beneath the arch where the shadows were deepest, was no longer empty. There was something standing in it, not a tree, not a shadow. Something that was the same color as the resin on the bound crowns, dark amber, almost brown, and that stood approximately 3 feet off the ground and did not move and did not breathe and did not, when Dennis stopped walking and stared at it, appear to have a face. He turned away. He told himself it was a shadow. He told himself it was a trick of the light. He told himself that the forest was playing games and that he was tired and that his eyes were unreliable. He told himself every lie that a rational person tells themselves when they have seen something that rationality cannot contain, and he walked back to camp, and he did not look back again. And behind him, in the arch of the bending pines, the thing that did not have a face tilted its head, rotated it slowly like an owl, like a door on a hinge, until it was watching him go. That night the silence deepened. Gareth's microphones recorded nothing. Not silence, nothing. The difference, he would later explain to Dennis in a voice that had the flat, affectless quality of a man describing a traffic accident he had been in, was that silence is the absence of sound, while nothing is the absence of the possibility of sound. Silence is what you hear between bird calls. Nothing is what you hear in a sealed room. The forest had sealed itself. The group ate dinner around a small camp stove. MREs, lukewarm coffee. Marcus was still energized, still talking about the bending pines, planning tomorrow's shoot. We'll get the drone up at dawn, catch the light coming through the canopy. I want a slow pan from the arch down to the base. Tanya, can you do a time lapse of the resin? If it's organic, it might change color with temperature. Marcus, Priya said. What? Something is wrong with this forest. Marcus looked at her. What do you mean? I mean the birds stopped, the insects stopped, the wind stopped. Gareth is recording nothing on his mics, and there was a heartbeat coming from the trees, Marcus, a heartbeat. Resonance, Marcus said. Probably water moving through a limestone channel under the root system. You get low-frequency vibrations that sound like a pulse. It's a known phenomenon. Then why was it coming from the crown of the tree, Marcus? Why was it coming from the nest? Marcus opened his mouth to answer and then closed it. He looked at Tanya for support. Tanya was cleaning a lens and did not look up. He looked at Gareth. Gareth was staring at his mixing board as though it had betrayed him. He looked at Dennis. Dennis, you've been in the field a lot. What do you think? Dennis thought about the thing in the arch, the amber-colored shape that did not have a face, the head that had rotated. He thought about what Kirk had said. You do not laugh at nothing you hear. I think we should sleep, Dennis said. And in the morning, I think we should talk about whether we want to keep going. Marcus stared at him for a moment, then nodded. Fine, we sleep. We talk in the morning, but we're not leaving. We just got here. They went to their tents. Dennis lay in his sleeping bag and stared at the nylon ceiling and listened to the nothing. The generator hummed outside. The nothing pressed against the tent walls like water. He slept, or rather he drifted in and out of a shallow, uneasy sleep that was more like unconsciousness with his eyes open, and in the spaces between he heard things. Not sounds, things. The quality of the air changed around his tent. Something walked past it. He knew this the way you know someone is standing behind you in an empty room, not because you heard them but because the room got heavier. Something walked past his tent, and then something walked past it again, and then something walked past it a third time, and each time the footfalls were lighter, as though whatever was walking was getting closer to the ground, or learning to move without touching it at all. At one point, deep in the false dawn, Dennis heard a voice. It was a whisper, and it came from directly outside his tent, and it said, I didn't laugh. He sat up. His heart was a fist. He grabbed the tent zipper and pulled it down and thrust his head out into the dark. The clearing was empty. The tents of the other 4 members were dimly visible in the residual glow of the generator's indicator light. Marcus's tent, Tanya's tent, Gareth's tent, Priya's tent, all closed, all silent. But Priya's tent was open at the back, not unzipped, open, as though something had come in through the side panel, tearing the nylon rather than unzipping it, and gone back out the same way. Dennis crawled out of his tent and stood up. The ground was damp. The air was cold. The forest was black, and the blackness had a texture to it, dense, granular, like wet charcoal. He walked to Priya's tent. He unzipped the front panel. He looked inside. Priya was gone. Her sleeping bag was zipped shut. There was a tear in the side panel of the tent, a long, clean tear not ragged as though something with a very sharp, very precise edge had cut it. The sleeping bag was zipped shut, and inside it the shape of a body was still visible, the contours of shoulders, hips, feet. Dennis unzipped the sleeping bag. It was empty. The shape had been maintained by the zipper and the nylon, but inside there was nothing. No Priya, no clothes, no blood. Just the empty shell of a sleeping bag that had, until very recently, contained a woman who had published 2 papers on Caribbean folklore and who had been the only person on this expedition who understood what they were walking into. Dennis stood in the clearing and felt the nothing pressing in on him from all sides, and he understood with the terrible, lucid clarity that comes only in moments of extremity that the forest had taken her. Not killed her, not dragged her, taken her. The way you take something off a shelf, the way you collect something. He wanted to scream. He did not scream. Something in him, some deep, atavistic instinct that was older than language and older than reason, told him that screaming was what the thing in the trees wanted. That screaming was a kind of laughter, that the thing in the trees could not tell the difference between a scream and a laugh, and that both were the same to it. A sound that meant you did not understand, and that because you did not understand, you were theirs. He closed his mouth. He zipped Priya's tent shut. He went back to his own tent. He lay down. He did not sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag and stared at the nylon ceiling and listened to the nothing and waited for the morning. And outside in the canopy above the camp, something moved through the pine branches without touching them, its prehensile tail curling around a branch and releasing, curling and releasing, as it carried its collection deeper into the forest. Dawn came gray and wet. A low fog had moved in overnight and the clearing was filled with it, ankle-deep, luminous, hiding the ground. Dennis unzipped his tent and stepped out into the fog and stood there, breathing, feeling the moisture bead on his face, and for a moment the forest was just a forest. Pines, fog, morning, the kind of landscape you'd see on a motivational poster. Then he found the goat. It was 20 feet from the clearing at the base of a pine tree. It was a small goat, juvenile, maybe 6 months old, with rough brown hair and the short, curled horns of a Bahamian domestic breed. It was dead. Its neck was snapped, not bitten, not torn, but snapped. The head rotated a full 180 degrees so that it stared backward over its own spine with glassy, reflecting eyes. The eyes were gone, not pecked out, not eaten, removed. The sockets were clean and dry as though the eyes had been extracted with surgical precision. The body had been positioned. There was no other word for it. The goat lay on its side, legs extended, head turned, in a posture that was unmistakably deliberate. It had been placed, arranged, displayed, like a specimen in a case, like a painting in a gallery, like a message written in a language that Dennis could not read but could feel in his stomach. He stood over the goat and stared at it, and the fog curled around his ankles, and the morning was gray and silent, and somewhere above him, in the canopy, something shifted its weight from one branch to another without making a sound. "Marcus," Dennis called. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "Marcus, get up. Everyone get up." Tents unzipped. Marcus emerged, bleary and irritated. Tanya emerged, alert and tense. Gareth emerged, pale and pouch-eyed, looking like he hadn't slept at all. "Where's Priya?" Marcus asked. He looked at Priya's tent. "Is she already up?" "She's gone," Dennis said. "Gone where?" "She's gone, Marcus." The fog absorbed his words. Marcus stared at him. Then he walked to Priya's tent and unzipped it and looked inside and saw the empty sleeping bag and the torn side panel. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned around and his face had changed. The performance awe was gone. The presenter voice was gone. What was left was a man who was beginning, just beginning, to understand that the world was not what he had built his career claiming it was. "We need to leave," Tanya said. She was already packing. Her movements were efficient and fast, the muscle memory of someone who had packed up in war zones under fire. Now, right now. Wait, Marcus said. Wait, we need to think about this, we need to. Marcus, Tanya stopped packing and looked at him. There is nothing to think about, Priya is gone. There is a dead goat that has been arranged outside our camp. The forest is silent. We are leaving. Marcus looked at Dennis. Dennis looked at the goat. The goat stared at nothing with its empty sockets. We're leaving, Dennis said. They packed in 15 minutes. Everything went into packs, tents, equipment, food, the generator. Gareth tried to carry his mixing board but abandoned it after 100 yards because it was too heavy and the trail was too narrow. He kept the headphones around his neck and the parabolic reflector collapsed in its case. Tanya kept the Steadicam. Marcus kept the GoPro. Dennis carried his own pack and the satellite phone and the GPS unit, and he walked at the front of the group, pointing the way back toward the logging trail. They walked for 3 hours. The fog thickened. The GPS showed them moving northeast toward the coast, but the forest didn't change. The same pines, the same gravel, the same saw palm meadows, the same silence. After 3 hours, Dennis stopped. He looked at the GPS. He looked at the forest. He looked at the GPS again. We're going in circles, he said. What? Marcus pushed forward and looked at the GPS screen. No. We've been heading northeast the whole time, the compass. The compass says northeast. The GPS says we're moving, but look. Dennis pointed at a tree to their left, a pine with a distinctive scar on its trunk, a lightning strike white and raw that he had noticed on the way in 2 days ago. We passed that tree an hour ago. We passed it 2 hours before that. We've passed it 3 times. The group stared at the scarred tree. The fog pressed in. The silence was total. The GPS is broken, Gareth said. Or the compass is broken, or the forest is moving, Dennis said. He said it quietly without drama because drama was a luxury they could no longer afford. The trails are moving. The landmarks are moving. The forest is rearranging itself around us. That's impossible, Marcus said. So is a heartbeat coming from a tree, Dennis said. They stood in the fog and the silence and the gray morning light, and for the first time, Dennis saw real fear on Marcus Pell's face. Not the performative fear of a man pretending to be scared for the camera. Not the intellectual discomfort of a man confronting something he couldn't explain. Real fear. The kind that loosens the bowels and tightens the throat and makes the world go very small and very bright. Then Tanya said, "Listen." They listened. At first there was nothing, the same nothing that had been pressing against them since the bending pines. But then, at the very edge of perception, at the frequency where sound becomes vibration and vibration becomes feeling, Dennis heard it. A voice, faint, coming from the northeast, coming from the direction they had been walking. It was Priya's voice. "Hello," the voice said. It was thin and far away, and it echoed, not the way a voice echoes off rock or water, but the way a voice echoes inside a long, curved tube, as though the forest were a throat and the voice were a whisper spoken into it. "Hello, can anyone hear me? I'm here, I'm in the trees, please help me." "Jesus Christ," Gareth said. "That's Priya, that's her voice, she's alive, she's out there." "Nobody move," Dennis said. "What do you mean, nobody move? She's calling for help." Marcus was already stepping forward toward the voice. "Priya, we're coming, keep calling." "Marcus, stop." Dennis grabbed his arm. Marcus shook him off. "Don't tell me to stop. She's alive. She's out there. We're going to get her." "Marcus, listen to me. Priya is gone. She was taken last night. She was taken out of a zipped sleeping bag through a torn tent wall. She is not calling to us from the trees. Something is using her voice." Marcus stared at him. His mouth worked. His eyes were wet. "You don't know that." "I know that," Dennis said, "and so do you." The voice came again, closer now. "Please, I'm scared. It's dark. I can't see. Please come get me." It was Priya's voice. Every inflection, every vowel, every particular cadence of a woman who had grown up in Bangalore and studied in London, and who pronounced her vowels with a precision that was uniquely hers. It was perfect. It was too perfect. It was a copy so accurate that it could only have been made by something that had heard her speak, and had memorized not just the sound, but the music of her voice, the way it rose at the end of a sentence, the way it softened on consonants, the way it carried in it the particular loneliness of a person who had spent her life among people who did not believe the things she believed. The voice called again, and each time it was closer, and each time the fog shifted in the direction of the voice, as though the fog were part of the thing that was speaking, as though the voice and the fog and the forest were all one organism, and it was calling them in. "Nobody goes toward the voice," Dennis said. His voice was low and steady and absolute. "We stay together, we move slowly, we do not run, we do not scream, we do not laugh, we walk." "Walk where?" Tanya asked. Her hand was on the Steadicam, gripping it like a weapon. "We're going in circles." "We walk south," Dennis said. "Forget the trail, forget the GPS. We walk south, toward the coast. The coast is the edge of the forest. If we can reach the coast, we can follow it to the nearest settlement." "How far is the coast?" Gareth asked. 10 miles, maybe 15. We can make it in a day if we keep moving." "And what if the thing that's using Priya's voice decides it doesn't want us to reach the coast?" Dennis looked at him. "Then we walk anyway." They turned south. The voice followed them. It called for another 20 minutes, Priya's voice, pleading, weeping, growing fainter and then louder and then fainter again, circling them like a predator circling prey. And then it stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse, because in the silence Dennis could hear something else. The soft, deliberate sound of something large moving through the canopy above them, branch to branch, without touching the ground. A prehensile tail curling around a branch, releasing, curling around the next. They walked south. The fog pressed in, and the forest watched them with the patience of something that had been waiting for them for a very, very long time. They walked south for 6 hours. The fog never lifted. It clung to the forest floor and rose to knee height and then waist height and then, impossibly, to chest height, as though the air itself were slowly drowning. Dennis led the group, pushing through the saw palmettos with his arms out in front of him, navigating by the gray light that filtered through the canopy. North was where the light was brightest, south was where it was dimmest, and the coast, God willing, was somewhere beyond the dimness. No one spoke. Marcus walked behind Dennis, the GoPro off now, the red recording light dark, his hands in his pockets, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. Tanya walked behind Marcus, the Steadicam balanced on her shoulder but the camera pointed down, the lens cap on because there was nothing she wanted to film and everything she didn't. Gareth walked behind Tanya, his headphones around his neck, the parabolic reflector in its collapsed case on his back, and he was muttering. Not words, not prayers, just a low, constant vibration in his throat, the sound a man makes when his nervous system has overrun his vocabulary and all that's left is noise. The forest rearranged itself around them. Dennis was certain of this now. Trees that he recognized, by their shape, their lean, the pattern of their bark, appeared and reappeared in different configurations, as though the pines were pieces on a board and something was moving them. Trails that had been straight were now curved. Clearings that had been open were now choked with undergrowth. The landscape was not hostile in the way a desert is hostile, by being empty and lethal. It was hostile in the way a mind is hostile, when the mind belongs to something that does not want you to leave. At the 4-hour mark, they found another display. It was a bird, a Bahama parrot, its plumage brilliant green and red, its beak the color of bone. It was dead. It had been pinned to the trunk of a pine tree with a thin, sharpened stick, the kind of stick that could have been a twig but wasn't, because twigs don't get sharpened to a point fine enough to pierce feather and flesh and bark without bending. The bird was spread-eagled, wings extended, legs splayed, and its head had been rotated 180 degrees, so that it stared at them from the tree with one empty socket and one eye that was still bright and wet and somehow, in the flat gray light, accusatory. Beneath the bird, carved into the bark with the same precision that had sharpened the stick, was a symbol, not a letter, not a word, a shape, 3 lines radiating from a central point like a hand with 3 fingers, 3 toes, the Chickcharney's signature, written in the language of the forest. "Don't look at it," Dennis said. "Keep walking." "Someone put that there," Marcus said. His voice was hollow. "Someone nailed a bird to a tree. There are people out here. There are people doing this." "There are no people out here, Marcus." "Then who?" "Keep walking." They kept walking. An hour later the fog began to thin. The ground sloped downward. The pines thinned. Dennis felt a surge of something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. The coast, maybe, the edge of the forest, the boundary beyond which the thing in the trees could not or would not follow. Then Gareth screamed. It was a short scream, cut off almost immediately as though a hand had been placed over his mouth, but it was enough to stop the group. Dennis turned. Gareth was 3 feet off the ground. He was hanging from a branch, held there by something wrapped around his ankle. The something was long, muscular, covered in short, dense feathers the color of pine bark, and it was pulling him upward with a smooth, mechanical force that made no sound. Gareth's hands clawed at the tail. It was a tail, Dennis could see it now, a prehensile tail, thick as a man's arm and twice as long. But the tail was slick with something, an oil or a resin, and his hand slipped. The headphones flew off his neck and hit the ground. The parabolic case fell from his back and burst open, and the reflector rolled across the pine needles and came to rest against a root. Gareth's scream came again, muffled, choking, and then there was a sound that Dennis would hear for the rest of his life. A wet, deliberate crack, like a knuckle being popped but larger, much larger, followed by a second crack and a third, and then Gareth went limp. Not dead, Dennis could see his chest heaving, his arms hanging, but limp, as though his spine had been turned off. The tail retracted, Gareth rose, the canopy swallowed him, a branch shook, a second branch shook, and then silence. Dennis stood in the thinning fog and stared at the canopy and did not move. His body was a sculpture of stillness. His heart was a machine running at full capacity but making no external sound. His mouth was closed. His hands were at his sides. Every instinct he had, every animal instinct, every survival instinct, every instinct that had kept his ancestors alive in forests far older than this one, was telling him the same thing in the same language: be still, be silent, be small, be nothing. Tanya broke. Dennis heard it happen, the sharp intake of breath, the stuttered exhale, the word forming in her throat like a bubble in tar. He turned and put his hand over her mouth. She struggled. He held her. She was strong, stronger than he expected, the strength of a woman who had carried camera equipment through active war zones. But he pressed his palm against her lips and his forehead against hers, and he looked into her eyes with a ferocity that was not violence but desperation. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't make a sound, don't scream, don't cry, don't say anything. It hears everything. It wants you to scream. The scream is how it finds you. Do you understand me?" Tanya's eyes were wide and wet, and her body was shaking against his, but she stopped struggling. She nodded. He took his hand away from her mouth. Marcus was frozen. He hadn't moved since the tail appeared. He stood in the trail with his arms at his sides, and his face the color of wet cement and his mouth slightly open, and he was breathing through his teeth in short, shallow gasps that fogged in the cold air. "Marcus," Dennis said, very quietly, "Marcus, look at me." Marcus didn't look at him. Marcus was staring at the canopy where Gareth had disappeared. His eyes tracked left and left again, as though he were watching something move through the branches. "He's alive," Marcus said. His voice was a whisper. "He has to be alive. We have to get him down. We have to." "He's not alive," Dennis said. "You don't know that." I know that, Marcus, and you know that. We need to move. Now south toward the coast, slowly, quietly. Something fell from the canopy. It landed in the pine needles 10 feet from them with a soft, wet sound. Dennis didn't look at it. Tanya didn't look at it. Marcus looked at it. It was Gareth's shirt. Just the shirt. Not torn, removed. The buttons were still buttoned. The collar was still folded. The shirt had been taken off Gareth's body the way a person takes off a shirt, by unbuttoning it and pulling it over the arms and sliding it off. But Gareth's arms had not been in a position to cooperate, and the precision with which the garment had been removed from a struggling, dangling, possibly paralyzed man was more horrifying than any violence could have been. It was the care that made it monstrous, the delicacy, the three-fingered hands working the buttons one by one, sliding the fabric down the arms, treating the man not as prey but as a specimen, a thing to be examined, a thing to be collected. Marcus made a sound. It started as a moan and built toward a shout, and Dennis was on him in 2 steps, hand over his mouth, the same ferocity, the same desperation. Stop, stop it, stop. Marcus's eyes were wild. His body was rigid. Dennis could feel the shout building in his chest like steam in a pipe. If you scream, Dennis whispered, directly into Marcus's ear, so close that his lips touched the skin, it will come for you next. It is in the trees right now. It is watching us right now. It can hear your heartbeat. And if you scream, it will know that you are afraid, and it will know that you do not respect it, and it will take you the way it took Gareth, and the way it took Priya, and the way it took that goat and that bird. Do you understand? Marcus's body softened. Not calmed, softened, the way a muscle softens when it has been clenched for so long that it simply runs out of force. His breathing slowed. His eyes refocused. He nodded. Dennis took his hand away. They moved south. The next 3 hours were the longest of Dennis Farrow's life, and they passed in a gray, fog-draped silence that was broken only by the sound of their boots on pine needles and the occasional, distant crack of a branch somewhere above them. The Chickcharney was tracking them. Dennis knew this because he could feel it. Not see it, not hear it, but feel it. The way you feel someone watching you from a window when you're walking down a street at night. The weight of attention. The pressure of being observed by something that had more patience than you and more reasons to be patient. Tanya walked with the Steadicam on her shoulder, not filming, but holding it the way a soldier holds a rifle, ready, familiar, a thing between her and the world. Marcus walked behind her, his eyes on the ground, his hands in his pockets, his presenter persona shed like a skin. He looked smaller without it, older. The tan that had made him look robust in the charter boat now made him look jaundiced, and the stubble that had seemed rakish in the pre-production meeting now made him look like a man who had been awake for too long and who might never sleep again. The fog thinned further, the ground sloped. The pines began to space out, and between them Dennis could see the flat gray of sky, not blue, not the Caribbean blue that had dazzled them on the boat, gray, overcast, a sky that had closed itself off. They emerged from the tree line onto a ridge, and below them, perhaps 200 feet down a gentle slope, was the coast. Not a beach, a marsh. Mangroves and salt flats and shallow tidal pools that stretched toward the horizon, where the gray sky met the gray ocean in a seam of silver. It was ugly. It was desolate. It was the most beautiful thing Dennis had ever seen because it was outside the forest. There, Dennis said, the coast, we follow it west. There should be a settlement within a few miles. Marcus looked at the marsh and then looked back at the forest behind them. His face was unreadable. What about Gareth? What about Priya? They're dead, Marcus. You don't know that. I know that. Marcus looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. It was a small nod, a defeated nod. The nod of a man who has spent his entire life telling other people that the world is explainable, and who is now standing on a ridge in a fog-drenched forest on an island in the Bahamas, looking at the place where 2 people he was responsible for were taken by something he cannot explain, and who has nothing left to say. They began to descend the ridge. The slope was gentle, but the footing was treacherous. Wet limestone, loose gravel, patches of mud that sucked at their boots. Dennis went first, testing each step before committing. Tanya followed. Marcus followed Tanya. They had been descending for perhaps 5 minutes when Marcus stopped. "Wait," he said. "Wait, listen." Dennis stopped. He listened. There was a sound, not from the forest behind them, from below, from the marsh. It was a sound that Dennis couldn't immediately categorize. It was rhythmic, organic, a kind of clicking or chittering or... No, it was a voice, Gareth's voice. "Hello," Gareth's voice said from somewhere in the mangroves below. "Hello, is someone there? I can't move. I think my back is broken. Please, please help me. I'm in the water. I'm in the water and I can't move." The voice was perfect. Every vowel, every consonant, every particular Irish inflection that Gareth Mooney had brought with him from Galway and had never bothered to soften. It was Gareth's voice the way a mirror is your face, accurate, precise, and completely devoid of the thing it was reflecting. "He's alive," Marcus said, and his face lit up with something that was worse than fear, hope, the cruelest emotion, the one that makes you move toward the thing that will kill you. "He's down there, he survived, we have to." "Marcus, that is not Gareth." "It's his voice, Dennis. I've worked with him for 3 years. I know his voice." "It's not him, it's the thing from the trees. It's using his voice the way it used Priya's, to lure you. Marcus, listen to me. It carried Gareth up into the canopy. It stripped his shirt off with its fingers. It broke his spine. Gareth is dead. What you're hearing is the thing that killed him, wearing his voice like a coat." Marcus stared at him. His eyes were bright. His jaw was set. He was a man who had built his career on the proposition that the world was rational and that anyone who believed otherwise was a fool, and he was now standing at the intersection of rational and irrational, and the rational side was telling him to walk into a marsh toward a voice that belonged to a dead man. "Don't go down there," Dennis said. "Please, Marcus, don't go." Marcus looked at the marsh. The voice called again. "Please, I'm cold. The water is rising, please." Marcus took a step down the slope. "Marcus," Tanya grabbed his arm. Marcus pulled away. He pulled away with a force that surprised both of them, a convulsive, desperate yank that nearly pulled Tanya off her feet. "He's alive," Marcus shouted, and the shout echoed off the ridge and through the mangroves and into the gray sky, and the forest behind them, which had been silent, answered. Not with a sound, with a movement. The canopy behind the ridge shook. Not one branch. Not two. The entire canopy, as though something enormous had landed in it, or as though the trees themselves had flinched. The voice from the marsh stopped. And then from the tree line above them, from the dark space between the pines where the fog was thickest, something dropped. It dropped like a stone. No rustle of branches. No warning. Just a shape falling 15 feet from the canopy to the ground, landing in a crouch that absorbed the impact with a muscular feline fluidity that no owl, no bird, no animal Dennis had ever seen or studied could replicate. It stood up. It was 3 feet tall. This was the first thing Dennis noticed, because 3 feet was the height that every account of the Chickcharney specified, and seeing it confirmed, seeing the number made flesh, made feather, made real, was a kind of horror that bypassed the brain and went straight to the spine. 3 feet tall. Feathers the color of pine bark, mottled and irregular, patterned not for beauty but for camouflage. A body that was upright, humanoid, with a chest that was broad and deep, shoulders that were set high and forward, and arms that ended in hands. 3 fingers on each hand. 3. Not 4. Not 5. 3 long, articulated fingers with tips that were dark and pointed and wet. The head was the worst part. It was round, larger than it should have been for a body that size. It was feathered, but the feathers around the face were shorter, finer, almost like fur, and they framed a face that was not an owl's face and not a human's face, but something that had been assembled from the parts of both. The eyes were red, not bloodshot, not the red of a rabbit's eye in a flashlight. Red. The deep, saturated red of something that had been red since before red had a name. They were set forward, not to the sides, and they were fixed on Marcus with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with judgment. And the head was rotating. Slowly, smoothly, without any of the mechanical stuttering of an owl's head turn, the Chickcharney's head swiveled on its neck. It turned to the left, scanning the ridge. It turned to the right, scanning the slope. It turned all the way around. 180 degrees, 200, 270, until it was looking behind itself at the forest, at the canopy from which it had dropped, and then it kept going, 360 degrees, a full rotation, and came back to rest facing Marcus. It had looked at all of them. In a single, unhurried rotation, it had looked at every person on that ridge, and it had seen them, and it had assessed them, and Dennis knew, with the same bone-deep certainty that had told him to stay silent in his tent, that it had already decided who would live and who would die. Marcus screamed. It was the scream of a man who had spent his entire life not believing in monsters and who was now standing in front of one. It was not a word. It was not a name. It was not a plea. It was the raw, uncompressed sound of a mind encountering something it could not integrate, and it was loud, and it was long, and it was the worst thing Marcus Pell could have done. The Chickcharney's head snapped forward. Its red eyes locked on Marcus. Its three-fingered hands flexed, the fingers spreading wide, the tips glistening, and its prehensile tail, which had been coiled behind it like a spring, uncurled with a speed that Dennis's eyes could not track. The tail shot forward, wrapped around Marcus's ankle, and pulled. Marcus went down. He hit the limestone slope on his back and slid. The tail retracted. Marcus slid toward the Chickcharney. His fingers clawed at the gravel, at the roots, at the air. The GoPro flew off his chest and bounced down the slope and landed in a tidal pool, where it recorded the sky for 30 seconds before the water reached the lens. The Chickcharney did not kill Marcus immediately. It held him by the ankle, dangling, and it looked at him with those red eyes, and its head tilted, rotated 30 degrees to the left, then 30 degrees to the right, the way a bird examines a seed before deciding whether to eat it or cache it. Then it opened its beak. The beak was not an owl's beak. It was too wide, too many angles. It opened vertically and horizontally at the same time like a flower made of bone, and inside there were teeth. Not the flat, grinding surfaces of a seed-eating bird. Teeth. Small, sharp, curved inward, the teeth of something that had evolved to hold things still while it worked on them. It made a sound, not a screech, not a call. A sound like a voice played backward, the cadence of speech, the rhythm of language, but the phonemes reversed and distorted as though it were trying to speak and had not yet learned which direction the words should go. And then it spoke. It spoke in Marcus's voice. Monster, it said. The word was Marcus's word, the same intonation, the same clipped consonants, the same American vowels, but it was wrong. It was too accurate. A perfect copy of a voice that had just screamed, copied, and played back in the space between heartbeats. Monster, freak, what are you? What are you? It was playing back Marcus's words, not from the scream from earlier, from the bending pines, from the clearing where Marcus had carved his initials. Dennis realized this with a cold, sinking clarity. The Chickcharney had been listening. From the moment they arrived, from the moment Marcus first opened his mouth and began narrating his presenter voice into the GoPro, the thing in the trees had been listening, recording, memorizing, and now it was playing it back, selectively, deliberately, the words that mattered, the dismissals, the mockery, the laughter. You do not laugh at nothing you hear, Kirk had said, and Marcus had laughed, at the heartbeat, at the nest, at the folklore, at the very idea that there was something in this forest older and more real than his streaming series. The Chickcharney pulled Marcus into the trees. It moved with him, still dangling from the tail, still conscious, still screaming. And the last thing Dennis saw before the canopy closed over them was Marcus's hand, reaching back toward the ridge, fingers extended, grasping at nothing. The screaming stopped. The forest was silent. Dennis and Tanya stood on the ridge. The fog was thin. The gray sky was visible. The marsh stretched below them toward the sea. They were 200 feet from the edge of the forest, 200 feet from the outside. "Move," Dennis said. Tanya moved. They descended the ridge together, not running. Dennis wouldn't let them run, because running was noise and noise was attention and attention was death. But moving fast, their boots slipping on the wet limestone, their breath ragged, their bodies running on adrenaline and terror and the desperate animal need to put distance between themselves and the thing in the trees. They reached the bottom of the slope. The mangroves rose around them, twisted, salt-crusted, their roots arching down into the shallow water like the legs of enormous spiders. The ground was soft. The air smelled of brine and decay. The sky was gray and close. And then Tanya stopped. "Dennis," she said. Her voice was very calm. The calm that comes after fear has burned through everything else and left only clarity. "Dennis, look at my arm." Dennis looked. Tanya's left arm, the arm that had been holding the Steadicam, was covered in a fine white substance. Not dust, not pollen, fibers. Tiny, almost invisible fibers like the down of a baby bird clinging to her skin and to the sleeve of her shirt and to the handle of the Steadicam. "What is that?" Dennis asked. "I don't know, it's on me. It's been on me since the ridge, since the thing dropped down. When it rotated its head, I felt something like a breeze, but not a breeze, like air moving over fur, or feathers." Dennis looked at the fibers more closely. They were moving, not falling off, not being blown, moving, curling, tightening against Tanya's skin as though they were sensing it, reading it, memorizing it. "Brush it off," Dennis said. "Now all of it." Tanya put down the Steadicam and began brushing at her arm. The fibers came off reluctantly, clinging, then releasing, then floating to the ground, where they lay in the mud and did not dissolve and did not disappear and did, if Dennis looked very carefully, continue to move. They left the Steadicam. They walked into the marsh. The mangroves were a maze. Roots arched overhead and underfoot. Water pooled in shallow, brackish channels that stank of sulfur and rot. The footing was treacherous. Every step was a negotiation between solid root and soft mud, and the mud wanted to keep them. It sucked at their boots. It grabbed at their ankles. It was, Dennis thought, almost playful in its malice, the way the forest had been playful in its malice, reshuffling trails, moving landmarks, using dead voices to lure the living deeper. Tanya was ahead of him. She was moving well, steadily, carefully, her long legs navigating the root system with the kind of spatial awareness that came from years of carrying heavy equipment through difficult terrain. Dennis followed in her footsteps, literally, placing his boots where she placed hers. They had been in the mangroves for perhaps 20 minutes when Tanya stopped again. "Listen," she said. Dennis listened. In the mangroves there was ambient sound, the drip of water from roots, the distant lap of tide against the salt flats, the hum of some unseen insect. Real sound, natural sound. The forest's silence had not followed them into the marsh. This was encouraging. This was evidence that the Chickcharney's territory ended at the tree line. But Tanya was not listening to the ambient sound. She was listening to something else. From behind them, from the ridge, from the forest, from the pine barrens came a voice. Not Gareth's voice, not Priya's voice, not Marcus's voice. Tanya's voice. "Tanya," the voice called. It was bright and urgent, and it had her exact cadence, the clipped British vowels, the slight upward inflection on the last syllable of her name, the way she pronounced it, Tanya rather than Tanya. It was her. "Tanya, wait, I'm coming, wait for me." Tanya's face went white. She turned to Dennis, and in her eyes he saw something he had not seen in her before. Not fear, not grief, not shock, but anger. A cold, clean anger that was the precise inverse of the Chickcharney's mockery. "That thing," she said, "is using my voice." "Yes." It heard me, it memorized me, it's wearing me. Yes. How do I make it stop? Dennis looked at her. He looked at the white fibers still clinging to her arm. He looked at the mangrove roots and the gray sky and the salt flats and the distant silver line of the ocean. He looked at all of it, and in the looking he felt something shift inside him. Not courage, not hope, but understanding. A clarity that was born of extremity and that was, in its own terrible way, a gift. You can't make it stop, he said, but you can refuse to answer. They walked on. The voice called after them, Tanya's voice, pleading, then angry, then weeping, cycling through emotions with the mechanical precision of a playback loop, testing each one like a key in a lock, looking for the one that would turn. Tanya did not answer. She walked through the mangroves with her jaw set and her eyes forward and her hands clenched at her sides, and the voice behind her grew fainter and fainter, and then, finally, was gone. They emerged from the mangroves onto the salt flats an hour later. The flats were vast, miles of cracked white mud stretching toward the sea, flat and barren and open, with no trees and no cover and no shadows in which anything could hide. The wind, for the first time in days, was blowing. It came off the ocean, steady and salt-laden, and it felt like the breath of a living world. Dennis stopped at the edge of the salt flats and turned to look back at the forest. The pines rose behind the mangroves, tall, straight, boringly symmetrical, their crowns dark against the gray sky. From this distance they looked like any other forest, like trees, like scenery. But Dennis could see at the very edge of the tree line a shape, small, 3 feet tall, standing between two pines, motionless, watching. Even at this distance, even across the mangroves and the ridge and the quarter-mile of marsh, Dennis could see the red of its eyes, not bright, not glowing, just red. The red of something that had been watching since before the pines were planted and that would be watching long after they fell. He turned away. He stepped onto the salt flats. Tanya, he said, walk with me, don't look back. She didn't look back. They walked across the salt flats toward the ocean, toward the world, toward the thin, distant line where the gray water met the gray sky, and behind them in the forest, the Chickcharney watched them go, and its head rotated slowly, tracking them across the flats with the patience of something that had all the time in the world and that knew. As Dennis would one day know that the market had left, the white fibers, the sensory down, the invisible signature that said this one was mine, was permanent, and that the world was smaller than it seemed, and that forests were everywhere, and that some debts were not paid in a single lifetime. The salt flats ended at a beach, a real beach, this time with proper sand, pale and coarse, littered with shells and driftwood and the dried husks of land crabs. The ocean beyond it was not the turquoise of the tourist brochures. It was gray-green, choppy, capped with white foam, and it stretched to the horizon like a vast, cold invitation. Dennis stood at the waterline and felt the wind on his face and the sand under his boots and the terrible, physical weight of the world. The real world. The world of weather and geography and human habitation, settling back onto his shoulders like a coat he had taken off and forgotten. He was shaking. Not the dramatic, full-body shaking of a man in a movie who has just survived an ordeal and who throws himself onto the sand and weeps. A smaller shaking. Internal. The shaking of a system that has been running on emergency reserves for too long and that is beginning, now that the emergency is over, to vibrate apart at the molecular level. Tanya was not shaking. Tanya was sitting on a piece of driftwood 10 feet from the waterline, staring at the ocean, her face blank and composed and utterly unreachable. She had not spoken since the mangroves. The white fibers on her arm were gone, brushed off, washed off by the salt spray. But Dennis had seen her looking at the place where they had been, running her fingers over the skin as though checking for a scar, and the look on her face was not relief. It was the look of someone who knows that the absence of a wound is not the same as the absence of an injury. They waited. There was nothing else to do. The beach faced west and the settlement. if there was a settlement, would be somewhere along the coast. Dennis didn't know which direction. He didn't have the GPS anymore. He dropped it somewhere in the mangroves, along with the satellite phone, along with everything except the clothes on his back and the memory of what had happened. The memory, that was the thing he carried. Not in his pack, not in his pocket, but in the meat of his brain, where it would sit for the rest of his life like a splinter too deep to extract. The hand, the severed hand, Marcus's hand, the hand he had used as a lure, that was already fading, becoming dreamlike, becoming the kind of memory that the mind wraps in cotton and files under things that probably didn't happen. But the other things, the rotation of the head, the red eyes, the voice that was not a voice but a playback, the 3 fingers working the buttons of Gareth's shirt, those things were not fading. They were sharpening. They were becoming more real with every minute that passed, as though the Chickcharney, by taking his companions, had left something of itself in Dennis's mind, a seed of memory that was growing rather than decaying. He understood, standing on that beach with the wind in his face and the gray ocean stretching to the horizon, that he would never fully leave the pine barrens of Andros Island. Not because the Chickcharney would follow him. It was a territorial creature, bound to the forest, bound to the bending pines, but because the forest had seen him, had assessed him, had found him worthy not of death but of remembrance. And remembrance, Dennis was beginning to understand, was the Chickcharney's true currency. It didn't kill for food. It didn't kill for sport. It killed for attention. It wanted to be remembered. It wanted the survivors to carry its image out of the forest and into the world, like missionaries carrying a gospel, and to spread the word, not through screens and streaming series and GoPro footage, but through the older, truer medium of terror, of the story told around a fire, of the whisper in the dark. Marcus had wanted to debunk the Chickcharney, to reduce it to biology, to explain it away. And the Chickcharney had responded by making Marcus part of the story, permanent, irrevocable, his initials carved not into the bark of the bending pines, but into the memory of every person who would hear what happened on Andros Island. There was a terrible poetry in that. Dennis didn't appreciate it. He was too tired for poetry. He sat down on the sand next to Tanya's driftwood and stared at the ocean and waited for the world to come back and get him. The fishermen found them 2 hours later. A small boat, a dinghy, really, wooden, with an outboard motor that coughed and spat and ran on what appeared to be prayer and gasoline in equal measure, came chugging along the coast from the west. There were 2 men in it, both Bahamian, both weathered, both wearing the expression of men who had seen everything the ocean had to offer and were therefore difficult to surprise. They were surprised by Dennis and Tanya. The boat slowed. One of the men stood up and cupped his hands around his mouth. "You all right? You need help?" Dennis stood up, his legs almost buckled. "Yes," he said. "We need help. We were in the forest, our group didn't make it." The men looked at each other. Something passed between them, not surprise, not fear, but recognition. The expression of men who had heard this story before, or a version of it, and who knew that the forest took what it took and returned what it returned, and that the difference was not up to them. "Get in," the man said. "We take you to Red Bays." Red Bays was the nearest settlement, a tiny village on the west coast of Andros, a collection of wooden houses on stilts, a church, a dock, a population of perhaps 300 people who lived off the sea and the land and who had, Dennis would later learn, been telling stories about the Chickcharney for longer than anyone could remember. They were the descendants of Seminole Indians and escaped slaves who had settled on Andros in the 19th century, and they carried their folklore not in books but in their bones, in the way they spoke, in the direction they looked when someone mentioned the Pine Barrens. The boat ride took 40 minutes. Tanya sat in the bow with her knees drawn up and her face to the wind and did not speak. Dennis sat in the stern and watched the coast slide by, the mangroves, the salt flats, the ridge behind which the pine forest rose like a wall. From the water the forest looked beautiful, dense and green and ancient, the pines standing close together, their crowns catching the gray light, their trunks straight and strong and silent. He could not see the bending pines from the water. He looked for them. He scanned the tree line, looking for the arch, the two bent crowns tied together with vine and resin, the dark space beneath them where something stood that did not have a face and that rotated its head like a door on a hinge. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there, and he knew, with the same bone-deep certainty that had kept him alive, that the thing in the arch was watching him go. In Red Bays, they were taken to the clinic, a small concrete building with a cross on the door and a nurse who was also the doctor and also the dentist and also the mayor's sister. She checked them for injuries. Dennis had a sprained ankle, abrasions on his hands and forearms, and a heart rate that, she told him with professional understatement, was considerably elevated for a man sitting still. Tanya was physically intact but had a fine, white rash on her left arm that the nurse could not identify, and that did not respond to antihistamines. "What is this?" the nurse asked, touching the rash with a gloved finger. "I don't know," Tanya said. It was the first time she had spoken since the mangroves, and her voice was a ruin, hoarse, scraped, the voice of a woman who had been screaming internally for hours and who had only now found the exit. "Something in the forest. It got on me." The nurse looked at her. Then she looked at Dennis. Then she went to the window and looked out at the pine forest, which was visible from the clinic, its dark mass rising behind the village like a thought the village was trying not to think. "How many were in your group?" she asked. "5. How many came out?" "2. The nurse nodded. It was not a nod of condolence. It was a nod of confirmation, as though she had been expecting this number or a number like it and was simply noting that reality had, once again, matched the folklore. "I'll call Nassau," she said. "The police will come. They'll want a statement." She left the room. Dennis sat on the exam table and listened to the sound of her footsteps on the concrete floor, and then the sound of a telephone being dialed, and then the low, indistinct murmur of her voice. And beyond that, through the window, the sound of the wind in the pines. The pines. Even here in a concrete clinic with a cross on the door and a nurse who was also the dentist, the pines were present. Not the pine barrens, not the deep ancient forest where the bending pines stood, but pines nonetheless. Caribbean/pines, the same species, the same straight trunks, the same boringly symmetrical crowns. They lined the road into Red Bays. They stood in the schoolyard. They grew behind the church, their shadows falling across the graves in the cemetery. Dennis looked at them and felt something move in his chest. Not fear, something deeper, a recognition. The pines were the Chickcharney's medium, the way water is a shark's medium, the way air is a bird's medium. Where there were pines, there was the possibility of the Chickcharney, not the certainty. The possibility. And possibility, Dennis was learning, was worse than certainty, because certainty was a thing you could prepare for, while possibility was a thing that lived in the corner of your eye, in the space between seeing and not seeing, in the flicker of movement that you convinced yourself was the wind. He looked at the pines behind the church. One of them moved, not swayed, moved, a lateral shift an inch to the left as though something had bumped it. He looked away. He stared at the wall. He breathed. The police came from Nassau the next day. 2 officers, both Bahamian, both professional, both carrying the same look that the nurse and the fishermen had carried. The look of people who knew the story and who were performing the formalities not because they expected a resolution, but because the world required paperwork. Dennis gave his statement. He told the truth, most of it. He told them about the expedition, about the bending pines, about Marcus carving his initials. He told them about the silence, about the dead goat, about Priya's disappearance. He told them about Gareth being taken into the canopy. He told them about Marcus being dragged into the trees. He did not tell them about the Chickcharney. He did not describe the 3-foot-tall feathered creature with red eyes and 3-fingered hands and a prehensile tail. He did not describe the head rotation, the voice mimicry, the playback of Marcus's words. He did not describe the white fibers on Tanya's arm. He told them his companions had been taken by an unknown animal, possibly a predatory bird, possibly a primate. He didn't know, he hadn't seen it clearly. It was dark, it was foggy, it was fast. The police officers wrote this down. They did not press him. They did not ask follow-up questions about the unknown animal. They did not ask why, if he hadn't seen it clearly, he was so certain it was an animal at all. They wrote his statement in careful handwriting, read it back to him, asked him to sign it, and left. Before they left, one of the officers, the older one, a heavy-set man with gray temples and the slow, deliberate speech of someone who chose his words the way a surgeon chose instruments, stopped at the clinic door and turned back. "Mr. Farrow," he said. "Yes." "You're going home?" "Yes, tomorrow to the States." "Good." The officer paused. He looked at Dennis with an expression that was not quite compassion and not quite pity, but something in between, a recognition, perhaps, of what Dennis had been through and what Dennis would continue to go through for the rest of his life. "When you get home, Mr. Farrow, you stay out of the woods." Dennis looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean what I said. You stay out of the woods, any forest, any place where the trees grow close together and the light doesn't reach the ground." The officer's voice was low and matter-of-fact, the voice of a man who had grown up on this island and who knew, as Kirk had known, as the nurse had known, as the fisherman had known, that the Pine Barrens were not just a forest but a territory, and that the thing that lived in it had a longer reach than the forest itself. "The old people say the Chickcharney marks the ones who survive. It puts something on them, a scent, a trace, so it can find them again." "That's a superstition," Dennis said. He said it without conviction. He said it the way Marcus would have said it, and hearing the words come out of his own mouth in Marcus's voice, Marcus's cadence, Marcus's certainty, Marcus's desperate, hollow need for the world to be rational, made him feel sick. The officer looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was a small, tired smile. The smile of a man who had heard the word superstition 1,000 times and who knew that it was the last defense of the rational mind against the irrational world, and that it was a defense that always, eventually, failed. "Maybe so," the officer said, "but you stay out of the woods just the same." He left. Dennis sat in the clinic and listened to the sound of the police boat starting its engine and pulling away from the dock, and through the window, the pines swayed in the wind, and one of them, the one nearest the window, the one that had moved the day before, swayed just a fraction of a second after the others, as though it were not responding to the wind but pretending to. Dennis went home. He flew from Nassau to Miami, and from Miami to Atlanta, and from Atlanta to Portland, where he had an apartment that he had not seen in 3 weeks, and that, when he opened the door, smelled of stale coffee and old mail, and the particular blanketing anonymity of a life that had been lived in the spaces between work. He unpacked, he showered, he ate. He sat on his couch and stared at the wall and tried to watch television, and found that he could not look at a screen without seeing the GoPro's red recording light. He tried to read and found that he could not look at the words without hearing them played back in voices that were not his own. Priya's voice, Gareth's voice, Marcus's voice, all of them saying things they had never said, words rearranged by something that understood cadence but not meaning. He saw a therapist. The therapist was a kind, competent woman named Dr. Reyes, who specialized in trauma, and who listened to Dennis's account with the professional neutrality of someone who had heard many impossible things, and who understood that the impossibility of a thing was not proof that it hadn't happened. "Tell me about the mark," Dr. Reyes said. "What mark?" "The mark the police officer mentioned, the thing the creature left on you." Dennis looked at her. He had not told her about the Chickcharney. He had told her the same story he told the police, unknown animal, dark, foggy, fast. But Dr. Reyes had heard something in his account, some detail he hadn't realized he'd included, and she was asking about it now with the gentle, inexorable precision of someone pulling a splinter from under a nail. I don't have a mark, Dennis said. Mr. Farrow, you told me that your colleague Tanya had a white substance on her arm, fibers that moved on their own. You said the nurse couldn't identify them. That was Tanya, not me. And you're certain you don't have anything similar? Dennis started to say yes. He was certain. He was absolutely certain. He had checked, standing in the shower in his Portland apartment, the water running hot. He had checked his arms, his chest, his back, his neck, running his fingers over every inch of his skin, looking for the white fibers, the sensory down, the Chickcharney signature. He had found nothing. But then Dr. Reyes said, "Have you checked your scalp?" And Dennis stopped. He stared at her. His hand rose slowly to the back of his head. His fingers touched his hair. They moved through it, pressing against the scalp, searching. They found it. Not fibers, not a rash, not anything visible, a sensation. A place on the back of his scalp just above the occipital ridge where the skin felt different, not painful, not numb, but aware. As though the skin in that spot were awake in a way that the rest of his skin was not. As though it were listening. As though it were a tiny, dormant ear pressed flat against his skull, waiting for a frequency that it would recognize. Dennis pulled his hand away. He looked at Dr. Reyes. She was watching him with the careful, calibrated concern of a therapist who has just watched a patient discover something they were not prepared to find. "What did you feel?" she asked. Dennis didn't answer. He was looking past her through the window of her office at the trees across the street. They were not pines. They were maples. Oregon maples, broad and green, their leaves thick and heavy, their trunks thick and solid and entirely, completely unthreatening. One of them moved. Not swayed, not bent in the wind, moved, a lateral shift, an inch to the left. Dennis closed his eyes. He breathed. He kept them closed for a long time. When he opened them, the maple was still. The wind was blowing. The leaves were swaying. Everything was normal. But the spot on the back of his scalp was warm and getting warmer. And when he went home that night and stood in his bathroom and looked in the mirror and parted his hair and looked at the place on his occipital ridge where the skin felt awake, he saw, in the bright, unforgiving light of the bathroom fixture, a single white fiber. It was very small, very fine, almost invisible. It was moving. He did not go back to Andros. He did not go back to the Bahamas. He did not go back to any island, any coast, any place where the air smelled of salt and the wind came off the water and the trees grew close together. He took a job in the city. He moved to a high-rise in Chicago, where the tallest living things were the ornamental maples in the planters along Michigan Avenue, and where the only forests were the ones he could see from the 32nd floor of his apartment building, distant, miniature, reduced by altitude to green smudges on the horizon. He did not go into the woods. He did not walk in the park. He did not visit his sister in Eugene, because Eugene was surrounded by forest, and the forest was Douglas fir and western red cedar and not Caribbean/pine, but the Chickcharney did not care about species. It cared about density. It cared about canopy. It cared about the space between trees where the light didn't reach the ground and the sound didn't carry, and a 3-foot-tall creature with red eyes and 3-fingered hands could move through the branches without touching the earth. He kept his hair short. He checked the back of his scalp every morning. The white fiber was still there. It never grew. It never multiplied. It never spread. It just sat there, a single thread of something that was not keratin, that was not hair, that was, if he looked at it under the magnifying mirror he had bought, translucent and faintly luminous, and when the light hit it just right, pulsing. A nerve-rich fiber, a sensory organ, not his, the Chickcharney's. A piece of the creature grafted to his scalp, alive and listening and waiting for the conditions that would tell the thing in the pines on Andros Island, 3,000 miles and an ocean away, that the marked man was near trees again. Dennis lived with it. He had no choice. He could not remove it. He'd tried once with tweezers, and the pain had been so immediate and so total and so specific. A sharp, targeted agony that felt not like pulling a hair but like plucking an eye from its socket, that he had dropped the tweezers and sat on the bathroom floor and breathed through his nose and not tried again. He learned to live with the warmth on the back of his scalp. He learned to ignore the way it pulsed when the wind blew and the maples in the planters along Michigan Avenue swayed. He learned to walk quickly past the park, to avert his eyes from the trees, to live in the concrete and the glass and the steel of a city that had no canopy and no silence and no pines. He learned, he adapted, he survived. But at night, in the dark, in the silence of his 32nd floor apartment, with the city lights glowing through the windows and the Lake Michigan wind pressing against the glass, Dennis Farrell lay in his bed and felt the white fiber pulse on the back of his scalp. And he knew, with the same bone-deep certainty that had kept him alive in the pine barrens of Andros Island, that the Chickcharney had not let him go. It had let him leave. And the difference between leaving and being released was the difference between a door that was open and a door that was waiting to close. He saw Tanya once more, 6 months after the expedition. She was in London, where she had returned to freelance work. They met in a pub, her choice, not his, because pubs were indoors and London was a city of brick and stone, and the only trees were the ornamental planes along the embankment, and even those were too many trees for Dennis. But he went because Tanya had been there in the forest, and Tanya was the only other person in the world who understood. She looked different, thinner, harder. The close-cropped hair had grown out, and the new hair was streaked with gray that hadn't been there before. Her hands, which had been steady enough to operate a Steadicam in a war zone, had a fine, constant tremor. They drank. They didn't talk about the forest. They talked about the weather, about work, about the Netflix series that Marcus had been producing, and that would now never be released because its host and star had disappeared on an island in the Bahamas, and the footage was at the bottom of a tidal pool. Then, at the end of the evening, as they were putting on their coats, Tanya said, "Do you feel it?" Dennis didn't ask what she meant. He knew. "Yes," he said. "Me too," she said. "On my arm, where the fibers were, it's under the skin now. I can feel it. It wakes up when I'm near trees." "Have you been near trees?" "I live in London, Dennis. There are trees everywhere." They looked at each other. Two people who had been marked by the same thing in the same forest on the same day, and who now carried a piece of that thing in their bodies like a transplanted organ that the body could not reject because the body did not recognize it as foreign. It was not foreign. It was older than they were, older than their immune systems, older than their species, older than the pine forests of Andros Island. It was the Chickcharney's gift, its blessing, its curse. The thing that the folklore had warned about. If you treat the Chickcharney with respect, it will bless you with good luck. If you treat it poorly, it will curse you with bad luck and hard times. Dennis had not treated it poorly. He had not laughed. He had stayed silent. He had moved slowly. He had shown deference, and the Chickcharney had let him live. But the mark was not a blessing. It was not a curse. It was something else. Something the folklore didn't have a word for because the folklore was about the encounter and the mark was about the aftermath. The mark was the Chickcharney's way of saying, "I saw you, I spared you, and I will know where you are for as long as you live, and if you ever come back to the pines I will be there, and the next time respect will not be enough." Dennis said goodbye to Tanya at the door of the pub. They did not hug. They did not shake hands. They stood apart in the cold London air and looked at each other, and between them, in the space that separated two people who had survived the same impossible thing, there was a recognition that went deeper than friendship or trauma or shared experience. It was the recognition of two animals who had been tagged by the same predator and who knew, in the language that animals know, that the tag was permanent, and that the predator was patient, and that the world was full of forests. "Stay out of the woods, Tanya," Dennis said. "You too, Dennis." He walked away. The London streets were wet and bright. The plane trees along the embankment were bare, winter, leafless, their branches dark against the orange streetlight. They looked like bones. They looked like the pines of Andros, stripped of their camouflage, reduced to structure. One of them moved. Dennis did not look back. He walked to his hotel. He closed the door. He locked it. He stood in the dark room with his back to the wall and his hand on the back of his scalp, where the white fiber pulsed, warm and alive and listening, and he breathed. And he waited, and in the silence of the city, 3,000 miles and an ocean away, in the pine barrens of Andros Island, between two trees whose crowns had been bent and tied together with vine and resin, something stood in the dark and rotated its head slowly, like a door on a hinge, and watched. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.